Rick Prime strapped down, backups burning, watching evil Morty pull the Omega device schematics straight out of his skull. In a position with no power left, he makes an offer. "Never been a sidekick guy," he says, "but I'm starting to see the value. Batman and Robin." In the story we know and love, evil Morty says no, and the moment is gone in seconds. But what if he didn't? What if evil Morty saw the value in Rick Prime as a partner? Welcome to Rickalodin. Tonight we dive deep into the what-if world to see what would happen if Rick Prime and evil Morty joined forces, and what that would mean for the universe. Lay back, settle in, and enjoy the ride. Chapter 1. The lair is still smoking when it happens. Rick Prime's body, propped against the chair evil Morty strapped him into, twitches every few seconds as his neural interface continues bleeding data. The schematics for the Omega device still mid-transfer, streaming out of his skull in real time, while his backup clones burn out one by one somewhere in the walls of this place. Dying quietly in vats, Rick C-137 will never actually see. This is the moment the show gave the audience 8 seconds of. This is the moment we are about to spend an entire chapter inside of, because everything else in this story, every consequence, every fracture, every choice made by every character across the next 19 chapters, depends on exactly what happens here, in this room, while 2 of the 3 most important people in it are unconscious on the floor. Start with where everyone actually is, because the geography of this scene matters more than people give it credit for. Rick C-137 is down. Confirmed in Unmortrican, he takes a beating across the fight that leaves him unconscious, well before the final confrontation resolves, knocked out cold by Rick Prime, during the brutal, drawn-out fight that follows the killing of Slow Mobius. Morty Smith, his actual grandson, the boy who has been present for every stage of this hunt, who convinced evil Morty to even come along in the first place by warning him that Rick wouldn't handle succeeding in his revenge well, is also down, though less severely. In the canon timeline, it's evil Morty who eventually drags Rick's body into the room where Prime is restrained, revives him, and says the 2 words that close out that specific beat of the episode: "Knock yourself out." He does this because it serves his purpose. Reviving C-137 gives Prime someone to be killed by, which keeps the blood off evil Morty's hands, while still guaranteeing Prime's death. And it also sets up the sadistic choice the show is famous for building into its darkest scenes, forcing C-137 to decide in real time whether to stop evil Morty from walking away with the most dangerous weapon in the multiverse, or finish off the man who murdered his family. Rick chooses his revenge. He always was going to. That's the whole point of the choice being sadistic in the first place. But in this timeline, evil Morty never gets to that part of the sequence, because in this timeline, the 8 seconds where Prime makes his offer do not end in 4 flat words and a shrug. They end in a pause, a real one. Evil Morty keeps scanning, the schematics still streaming, his face doing nothing that Prime, restrained and bleeding out backups, is in any position to read. But something in him is turning the offer over, weighing it the way he weighs everything, coldly, structurally, looking not at what Prime is saying, but at what Prime is actually proposing underneath the words. Partnership, not subordination, not a leash, a seat at a table that has, as far as evil Morty's entire confirmed history shows, never once been offered to him by anyone, not by his own Rick, who he had to neurologically enslave just to stop being used, not by the Citadel, who wanted him as a president to prop up a system he despised, not by C-137, who brought him along on this hunt purely as a resource, purely because his intelligence was useful for tracking Prime down. Every single relationship evil Morty has had in his confirmed history has positioned him as either a tool or a threat. Prime, restrained, bleeding, seconds from either death or escape, is the first being in the history of this character to look at him and offer equal footing. That's the hinge. That's the entire hinge this story swings on, and it's worth sitting in it a little longer before we move forward, because the significance of it compounds the more you sit with it. Evil Morty doesn't answer right away. He finishes the download first, because he is not a being who lets sentiment interrupt a task already in motion, that much of his character remains completely intact in this divergence. The Omega device schematics finish transferring, the backups finish burning, and only then, with the download complete and the leverage already secured in his own head, does he actually turn and look at Rick Prime directly, for the first time since the offer was made. He asks him what exactly he's proposing, not out of desperation, not out of hope, out of the same cold, evaluative curiosity that has defined every decision he's made across his entire confirmed arc, From the moment he chose to enslave his own Rick instead of running from him, to the moment he chose to dismantle the Citadel from the inside instead of simply leaving it, to the moment he chose to destroy the central finite curve entirely rather than simply escape through it quietly. Evil Morty has never once, in any of his confirmed appearances, made a decision that wasn't the product of a full structural evaluation. This is no different. He is evaluating Rick Prime the way he evaluates everything, as a system, weighing what it would cost him against what it would give him. And for the first time since we've ever seen this character on screen, the answer that evaluation produces isn't no. While this conversation happens, low and quiet, in the ruined lair, on the other side of the room, something else is happening that neither of them notices, because neither of them is looking. Morty Smith is waking up. This matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about why, because the mechanics of how Rick survives in this timeline are not a small detail. They're the entire foundation the rest of this story is built on. In the real timeline, Rick's life is in Evil Morty's hands. He revives him deliberately, as a move in a larger game, and that act, whether Rick ever fully processes it or not, creates a debt. A complicated, uncomfortable debt to a being C-137 has every reason to distrust, but a debt nonetheless, one that shapes the uneasy, watchful relationship the two of them have in the episodes that follow on Mortrican in the real timeline, where Evil Morty keeps showing up, keeps leveraging the schematics, keeps treating C-137 as a resource he has some claim over, specifically because he chose, in that room, to bring him back. None of that happens here, because in this timeline, Evil Morty is not thinking about Rick C-137 at all. He is thinking about Rick Prime, and about the offer, and about the calculation running underneath his own skull, about what a partnership with the single most capable being in the multiverse might actually be worth, to someone who has spent his entire life trying to escape being controlled by exactly that kind of capability. Rick C-137, bleeding out on the floor of a lair that no longer has anyone in it paying him any attention, is not part of that calculation. He is an afterthought, a loose end nobody in that room is currently prioritizing, which means Morty has to save him himself. Picture it the way it would actually play out, grounded in who Morty Smith is by this point in the show's timeline, because by Unmortrican, Morty is not the same nervous, passive kid the pilot introduced. He's been shot at, dragged through interdimensional war, watched his grandfather nearly break in front of him more than once, and confirmed across seasons 4 through 7 to have developed a genuine, if complicated, resilience under pressure, the same resilience that let him shoot Rick in the head during a season 4 argument. The same resilience that let him talk Evil Morty into joining this hunt in the first place by making an argument about Rick's psychology that was sharp enough to actually work. This is not a helpless bystander. This is a 14 or 15-year-old who has been forged, however unwillingly, by a lifetime of exactly this kind of crisis. He comes to on the floor of the lair, disoriented, ears ringing, and the first thing he registers isn't the conversation happening across the room between Evil Morty and Prime. It's Rick, unconscious, bleeding, dangerously close to a piece of collapsing equipment that's sparking and threatening to come down. Morty doesn't think about strategy. He doesn't think about leverage or partnerships or the wider implications of what's happening 20 feet away. He crawls, drags himself upright, and hauls his grandfather away from the wreckage, out of instinct, out of the specific, uncomplicated love that has survived every single thing this show has put the two of them through, including the abuse, including the manipulation, including all of it. He doesn't have Rick's tools. He doesn't have Evil Morty's precision. What he has is what he's always had in moments like this, which the show has confirmed across multiple episodes, a working knowledge of Rick's tech absorbed through years of forced proximity, and enough raw desperation to make it work under pressure. He finds something, a stim injector, a piece of salvaged medical tech from Rick's own kit, something scavenged off the floor in the chaos of the fight, and he does what he's seen Rick do to himself 100 times across 100 adventures, jamming it in and hoping. It's clumsy. It's not clean. It's nothing like the deliberate, controlled revival Evil Morty performs in the canon timeline, but it works, because Rick's body, for all the damage it's taken, was built by Rick himself to survive exactly this kind of abuse, engineered with the same paranoid redundancy that defines every piece of technology this character has ever made for himself. Rick's eyes open to Morty's face above him, not Evil Morty's. That single image, that single point of difference, is the entire premise of everything that follows in this story. Because think about what that means for Rick C-137 specifically, given everything the show has confirmed about who he is underneath the performance. This is a man whose entire emotional architecture, established across everything we've covered, about his relationship with Diane, with grief, with control, is built around the terror of powerlessness. The terror of watching something terrible happen and being unable to stop it. The exact terror that defined the worst day of his life, in that garage in Dimension C-137. Waking up to discover that his life was saved not by an enemy exercising strategic mercy, not by evil Morty's calculated leverage, but by his own grandson acting purely out of love and desperation, is not a small thing to this specific character. It reframes the entire debt structure of the scene. In the real timeline, Rick wakes up owing something, however grudgingly, to a being he has every reason to distrust. And that debt colors everything that follows. In this timeline, Rick owes his life to Morty, the one relationship the show has spent 7 seasons establishing as the closest thing to unconditional this character has left. And Rick, confirmed across Season 5's Forgetting Sarah Morchak arc to be capable of recognizing genuine partnership when he sees it, capable of telling Morty directly that he never made him a true partner, is going to register what just happened, even in the disoriented, half-conscious seconds right after waking up. His grandson saved his life, while his archenemy, and the multiverse's most dangerous free agent, stood 20 feet away, negotiating a partnership that will define the rest of this man's existence. There's no time for that recognition to fully land, though, because the moment Rick's vision clears enough to process the room, he sees the two of them, Prime, still restrained but visibly recovering, and evil Morty, standing close, listening, actually listening, to whatever it is Prime is saying. And Rick, confirmed across every appearance of his life to be a man whose entire psychology reorganizes instantly around threat, around the specific, hyper-vigilant paranoia, bred by decades of hunting the person currently occupying that chair, understands immediately and completely, before either of them even notices he's awake, that something has gone catastrophically wrong. He doesn't have his portal gun in reach. He doesn't have a weapon he can grab fast enough. What he has is Morty, still crouched beside him, and the dawning, sick realization that the revenge he has spent decades building his entire fractured identity around is not, as it was supposed to be in this exact room in the exact timeline he remembers living, about to end. It's about to get infinitely more complicated, and by the time Rick manages to pull himself upright, by the time he manages to force enough strength back into a body that was moments ago being fed a stim injector by a terrified teenager, evil Morty has already turned, already noticed him watching, already made a decision that Rick has absolutely no power to reverse. The download is complete. The offer has been accepted, or is in the final, irreversible stages of being accepted. And Rick Prime, freed from his restraints now, not by force, but because evil Morty is undoing them himself, looks directly at Rick C-137, across the wreckage of the room, and says something that will define the entire rest of this story. Something the show never had to write, because in the real timeline, this exact moment never happens. Chapter 2. Look Who's Up. Bad timing. 2 sentences, delivered flat, almost bored, and inside them is the entire personality of the man who just spoke. Not triumph, not menace performed for effect. Just an observation, made the way a man might comment on traffic, because the being standing in the wreckage of that lair, freeing his own wrists while a 14-year-old grandson clutches at his revived grandfather 20 feet away, does not need to perform anything. He has never needed to. And to understand exactly what kind of catastrophe just walked free in that room, you have to go back to the beginning, to the actual, fully confirmed history of Rick Prime. Because everything that happens for the rest of this story depends on understanding precisely what kind of being evil Morty just agreed to work with. Start with the fact that established across Rick Mirai Jack in Season 5 and expanded fully in Unmortrican in Season 7, Rick Prime is not simply a version of Rick Sanchez. He is, as far as the show's own mythology is concerned, the origin point, the prime dimension, the Rick from whom the practice of interdimensional travel among the Sanchez lineage effectively begins, at least as far as the audience is ever shown. In the memory Rick C-137 shows the Galactic Federation back in Season 3, a memory the show spends 5 full seasons deliberately leaving ambiguous, before confirming its accuracy. A younger version of Rick is working in his garage in what will become Dimension C-137, when a stranger appears. Another Rick, from another dimension, offering him a portal gun and, with it, the keys to the entire accessible multiverse. That stranger is Rick Prime. Young Rick, the man who will become C-137, looks through the window at his wife Diane and his daughter Beth, playing in the yard, and says no. He tells the stranger he doesn't want it. He has everything he needs right there. Prime leaves, and then, confirmed directly in Rick Mirai Jack, a device drops from the sky and destroys the house. Diane and young Beth die in the explosion. That is the origin of everything. Not a philosophical disagreement. Not a rivalry born from competing ambitions. A man said no to another version of himself, and that version of himself could not tolerate it. So he came back and erased the reason for the refusal. Sit with the coldness of that mechanism for a moment, because it is the single most important thing to understand about Rick Prime as a character, and it is confirmed, not implied, not theorized by fans, directly stated across the show's own canon. He did not kill Diane and Beth because he wanted something from C-137. He did not kill them as leverage, or as a punishment with a purpose behind it, or as the opening move in some larger plan. He killed them because being told no by a version of himself was an irritation, and removing the source of an irritation was, to Rick Prime's specific psychology, simply the most efficient available solution. There is no ideology underneath that decision. There is no grievance being settled. There is only a being so completely without emotional friction that the deaths of an entire family register to him as a footnote in an afternoon that otherwise went according to plan. This is what separates Rick Prime from every other antagonist the show has ever produced. And it's why the show treats him differently than it treats the Galactic Federation, or the Citadel, or any of the other institutional threats across 7 seasons. Those threats have motives you can argue with. Rick Prime doesn't have motives in any sense that would let you negotiate with him, because motives require caring about an outcome beyond the most immediate, frictionless path forward. The show draws this distinction explicitly through the parallel it builds between Prime and C-137, a parallel confirmed across multiple episodes and made fully explicit in Unmortrican itself, where Prime, mid-fight, mid-torture, tells C-137 directly that he made him, that he showed him infinity, that C-137 would have been him if their positions had been reversed. Admit it, he says. You would have been me. It's a genuinely uncomfortable line, because it isn't entirely wrong, and the show knows it isn't entirely wrong. Both Ricks started from the exact same genetic and psychological baseline. Both were offered the same choice at some point in their timelines: the portal gun, the infinite multiverse, against the ordinary bounded life of a husband and father in a garage. The difference between them isn't intelligence, and it isn't capability, because both of those are, as far as the show ever demonstrates, essentially identical. The difference is what happened after the choice. C-137 said no, and had everything taken from him anyway, and the grief of that loss became the foundation of everything he built afterward. The drinking, the decades of hunting, the central finite curve, the walls, all of it constructed around a wound that never closed. Prime said yes, and simply kept saying yes, over and over, to every subsequent choice that offered him more capability and less attachment, until there was nothing left in him for anything to hold on to. Confirmed directly in the show's own material, Prime abandoned his own Diane and his own Beth in his home dimension without hesitation, the same way he abandoned every single consequence of every choice he ever made afterward. This is not a man who lost his humanity through trauma. This is a man who never developed the parts of himself that trauma usually breaks, because he never let anything matter enough to be traumatized by losing it. The scale of what he built with that emptiness is genuinely staggering, and it's worth walking through in full, because it's exactly the resource Evil Morty just agreed to attach himself to. After abandoning his family, Prime spent an unconfirmed but clearly extensive stretch of time developing technology and capability far beyond what any other Rick across the central finite curve is shown to possess. Confirmed in Unmortrican, he is the inventor of the Omega device, a weapon the show treats with more gravity than almost any other piece of technology across its entire 7-season run. The Omega device, described in the episode itself and expanded across the show's own supplementary material, is capable of permanently erasing a specific individual, or object, from every single version of every single dimension across the entire multiverse simultaneously, the moment even one variant of that individual is destroyed by it. It doesn't just kill, It doesn't just kill across dimensions in the way a determined Rick with enough portal fuel might eventually manage by hunting down every version of a target one at a time. It erases the target from the fabric of the multiverse entirely. In every timeline, in every branch, in every possible variation of reality that could exist, in a single, instantaneous action. And confirmed in the same episode, the device also alters and erases the memories of everyone connected to that individual, specifically to avoid the kind of paradoxes and unraveling that erasing someone from every version of reality at once would otherwise cause. This is confirmed directly through two separate pieces of evidence across the show. Slow Mobius's own children, after he is erased using the Omega device during the events of Unmortrican itself, are shown to have no memory of him at all, immediately, completely, as though the erasure rewrote not just his existence, but everyone's understanding that he ever existed in the first place. And earlier, in Hot Rick, Rick and Beth are both shown to have trouble remembering Diane clearly, despite having spent their entire lives with her. A detail the show confirms, retroactively connects to the Omega device having already been used on her by that point in the timeline. This is the weapon Rick Prime built, not as a theoretical exercise, not as a display of capability. He built it and used it, specifically and directly, on Diane, on every version of C-137's wife, across the entire multiverse, at some point after killing her in the original bombing. This detail, confirmed across the show's own material, connecting the Omega device's function to Diane's confirmed absence from the series, closes off the single most obvious hope C-137 might otherwise have carried through every season of the show he appears in. There is no dimension anywhere in the accessible or inaccessible multiverse where Diane Sanchez is alive, because Rick Prime erased her, specifically, deliberately, from all of them at once. And the confirmed motivation behind that decision is exactly as cold as everything else about this character. Ricks who lost their Dianes kept hunting him for revenge. Erasing the source of their grief was, to Prime, the most efficient available solution to an ongoing inconvenience. He did not erase Diane out of cruelty towards C-137 specifically. He erased her because grieving Ricks across the multiverse were becoming a persistent operational problem, and this was the fastest way to resolve that problem permanently. The scale of that decision, an entire being erased from the totality of existence, because her death was generating an annoying amount of follow-up violence, tells you everything you need to know about what kind of intelligence built the weapon Evil Morty just downloaded the schematics for. And this is where the character becomes genuinely difficult to sit with, because Rick Prime is not written, and has never been written, as simply a stronger or more ruthless version of a familiar archetype. He's written as something closer to a null hypothesis, a demonstration of what happens when you take the specific configuration of intelligence and capability that defines every Rick across the multiverse, and subtract the one variable that makes every other version of that character, including the show's own protagonist, watchable rather than simply horrifying. That variable is attachment. C-137's entire arc, everything covered in the earlier chapters of this analysis, the drinking, the walls, the central finite curve, the Diane AI he built and then eventually told to move on, the decades of hunting Prime specifically, all of it is generated by attachment, gone catastrophically, unbearably wrong. Prime never had the attachment to begin with, and so none of that machinery exists in him. He doesn't drink to numb anything, because there's nothing underneath requiring numbing. He doesn't build monuments to grief, because there's no grief. He doesn't hunt anyone out of a need for closure, because closure requires an open wound. And Prime, by every piece of evidence the show provides, does not have one. Confirmed in Unmortrican's own final confrontation, when C-137 finally corners him, Prime does not respond to the years of hunting, to the decades of buildup, to the entire weight of what this confrontation represents to the man standing across from him, with anything resembling fear or even real engagement. He treats it as mildly interesting. He mocks C-137's use of Diane's voice for his space cruiser AI, correctly identifying it as pathetic, as evidence of a man who never actually let go of something Prime erased from existence years earlier. He kills Slow Mobius in front of both Rick and Morty, not as a strategic necessity, but seemingly because he can, because it's a demonstration, because inflicting that specific pain on C-137 in that specific moment amuses him more than sparing an old man who never did anything to him personally. And in his final moments, restrained, beaten, dying, he does not beg, and he does not rage. He tries to reason with C-137, pointing out that he made him, that he showed him infinity, that everything C-137 has ever done with a portal gun exists because Prime gave the concept of interdimensional travel to the multiverse in the first place. It's not fear talking. It's the same cold, frictionless logic that has defined every decision this character has ever made. An attempt, right up until the final second, to solve the problem of his own death, the same way he's solved every other problem in his existence, through calculation rather than feeling. That confrontation ends with C-137 beating him to death with his bare hands, brutally, without hesitation, confirmed directly in the episode's own content. And that is where the real timeline ends for Rick Prime. A death without a reckoning, without acknowledgement, without the one thing C-137 spent decades of hunting, secretly hoping to extract from this confrontation. Some evidence that the man responsible for destroying his life understood, even slightly, what he had taken. Prime dies exactly the way he lived, without registering the weight of any of it. Except in this timeline, he doesn't die. In this timeline, the confrontation that was supposed to end everything gets interrupted before it can finish, because evil Morty, standing in that ruined lair, listening to an offer from the single most dangerous being in the show's entire mythology, decides the calculation runs the other way. Which means Rick Prime, the being who built a weapon capable of erasing anyone from the totality of existence, the being who has never once in his confirmed history let anything as small as another person's suffering interrupt his own priorities, is still alive, still free, and has just acquired, in the span of a single conversation, the single most capable and most dangerous ally he could possibly have found in this or any other timeline. Which raises the question this entire story now has to answer. What kind of mind agreed to work with him? Chapter 3. To understand what just happened in that lair, you have to understand that evil Morty is not, and has never been, simply a smarter or more ruthless version of an ordinary Morty. He is the show's most carefully constructed answer to a question. It spends 7 seasons circling, without ever stating outright, what happens to a person who is subjected to the exact same abusive, extractive relationship every other Morty across the central finite curve endures, except this particular person has the intelligence to fully understand what is being done to him while it's happening. Every other Morty the show has ever shown, including Morty Smith himself, absorbs the damage of that relationship without fully processing its architecture. Evil Morty processed it completely, and then, confirmed across every stage of his appearances in the show, systematically dismantled it. His first appearance, in Season 1's Close Rick Counters of the Rick Kind, plays almost entirely as a mystery box the audience isn't given the tools to fully solve at the time. Rick and Morty are pulled into a Citadel-wide investigation after a Rick is murdered, and the episode eventually reveals that the killer is a Morty, working with a version of Rick who has had his intelligence artificially suppressed by a device his own Morty designed and implanted, keeping that Rick calm, controllable, and entirely unaware of what was happening to him. The Morty behind it, later confirmed across the show's own material to be the character who becomes known as Evil Morty, removes his signature eye patch at the very end of the episode to reveal a mechanical eye underneath, and the show cuts away before anything more is explained. At the time, this reads as a clever twist ending, a dark little bow on an episode about Citadel bureaucracy and murder. In retrospect, confirmed by everything the show builds afterward, it's the first documented instance of the single pattern that defines this character's entire arc. Evil Morty does not run from a Rick who controls him. He neutralizes the control at its source, using intelligence and engineering rather than escape, and does so with enough precision that almost no one around him realizes what's actually happened until it's already finished. The show doesn't return to him directly for 2 full seasons, and when it does, in the Season 3 finale The Ricklantis Mix-Up, it does something the show rarely does with any character. It hands over almost an entire episode to explore the Citadel of Ricks as its own functioning society, completely independent of Rick C-137 or Morty Smith, who barely appear in it at all. And inside that exploration, the show reveals that this same Morty, the one from Close Rick Counters, has been running for president of the entire Citadel, campaigning on promises of reform, of dismantling the systemic abuse Mortys across the Citadel are subjected to as a permanent underclass. He wins, and in the episode's final minutes, alone in his new office, he is confronted by another Morty, one who has pieced together his history and recognizes him for what he actually is. That Morty accuses him directly, and the accused Morty, without denying anything, simply and calmly shoots him dead, before turning to face the camera with the specific chilling clarity that made this episode one of the most talked about hours of television the show has ever produced. He didn't run for president because he believed in the reform platform he campaigned on. He ran because the presidency was the most efficient available route to enough structural power to protect himself permanently from ever being subjected to a Rick's control again. And anyone who threatened to expose that, even another victim of the same system, another Morty, who might have once been an ally under different circumstances, was expendable the moment he became an obstacle. This is the single most important confirmed data point about Evil Morty's actual ideology, and it's worth being precise about what it does and doesn't mean, because the fandom has spent years arguing about whether this character is a hero or a villain, and the show's own answer, confirmed through his actions rather than his rhetoric, is that the question itself is slightly the wrong one. Evil Morty is not motivated by cruelty for its own sake. He's never once, across any of his confirmed appearances, shown pleasure in causing harm the way Rick Prime is repeatedly shown to. He's not sadistic. He's not performing dominance the way the Citadel's Rick-led power structure constantly performs it. What he is, confirmed consistently across close Rick counters, the Ricklantis mix-up, and everything that follows, is completely and totally committed to a single organizing principle, that he will never again exist as a resource inside a structure controlled by someone else, and that anything, anyone, any relationship, any alliance, any system that threatens that principle gets removed with the same cold efficiency he removed his own Rick's intelligence in the very first episode he appeared in. That principle reaches its fullest and most explicit articulation in the Season 5 finale, Rick Mirai Jack, which is confirmed across the show's own material to be the single most important episode for understanding both Evil Morty's philosophy and the actual structure of the multiverse he's been operating inside his entire existence. By this point in the timeline, Evil Morty has become president of the Citadel a second time, using the position not to reform it, as he claimed during his first campaign, but to systematically strip it for parts, an approach the show frames as consistent with his real motivation all along, since reform would have left the underlying structure and the underlying vulnerability it represents intact. He hijacks a portal gun manufacturing facility deep beneath the Citadel, uses it to open a connection to the central finite curve's actual control mechanism, and delivers a speech directly to Rick C-137, who has by this point been drawn into the collapsing Citadel alongside Morty Smith, that reframes the entire multiverse the audience has been watching for 5 seasons. He describes the central finite curve exactly as it functions, confirmed directly in the episode's own dialogue, as a wall around infinity, a deliberately isolated section of the otherwise infinite multiverse, containing only the dimensions where some version of Rick Sanchez is guaranteed to be the most intelligent being alive. Standard portal gun technology, the green portals every version of Rick across the show has used for the entirety of its run, only ever travels within that walled section. It was built, confirmed across the show's own established lore, connecting this episode to Rick C-137's specific history, largely through C-137's own efforts in the early period after he first gained portal technology. Originally as a mechanism to help him hunt Rick Prime by narrowing the search to a contained section of the multiverse, but expanded and maintained afterward by the Council of Ricks, specifically because it also guaranteed something else, something with no connection to hunting Prime at all. It guaranteed that every Rick who ever stepped through a green portal would land somewhere he remained dominant. Evil Morty describes every Morty born inside that structure, every version of every Morty across the entire curve, as having spent every version of every life inside an infinite crib built around what he calls an infinite baby, a description delivered with a specific, controlled contempt that the show lets sit uninterrupted, because it is, by every piece of evidence the episode itself provides, accurate. He goes further, confirming a detail that recontextualizes the entire relationship between Rick's and Morty's across the show's run. The Citadel, he explains, engineered the conditions for Beth and Jerry to meet and have children across countless dimensions, specifically because Morty's, whose particular brainwave pattern happens to cancel out a Rick's, are useful as a kind of biological camouflage, making it harder for enemies to track a Rick down. Morty's were not simply born into these families by chance. They were, across the confirmed structure of the central finite curve, effectively manufactured in bulk, harvested as a resource by an entire civilization of geniuses, who built a permanent underclass out of children, specifically because those children's neurology happened to be useful. This is the system Evil Morty grew up inside. This is the system his own Rick used him for, before he neurologically disabled that Rick, rather than continue being used by him. And this is the system he destroys at the end of Rick Morty Jack, using the hijacked facility to collapse the machine underneath the citadel that enforces the central finite curve's boundaries entirely, before stepping through a yellow portal, a color the show has never used before this episode, into whatever exists in the actual, unrestricted, infinite multiverse, beyond the wall Rick C-137 helped build. That yellow portal matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about why, because it's the single clearest piece of evidence the show provides about what Evil Morty actually wants, as opposed to what people assume he wants, based on the scale of destruction he's capable of. He does not use his access to the collapsing curve's infrastructure to seize control of the Citadel more completely, or to declare himself supreme across every remaining dimension inside the wall, or to hunt down and eliminate every other Rick as a lingering threat to his own safety, all of which would have been well within his demonstrated capabilities at that point in the episode. He destroys the wall and leaves, confirmed directly through the choice the show makes to have him vanish into a section of the multiverse the audience has never seen, that no green portal has ever been shown reaching, a place explicitly coded as being beyond the reach of every other Rick across the entire curve, including, crucially, Rick C-137 himself. His stated goal, delivered through his own words in that finale, and consistent with every action he's taken across every prior appearance, was never conquest, it was escape. Total, permanent, structurally guaranteed escape, from a system built specifically to keep beings like him contained, categorized, and useful to the actual center of that system's power. This is confirmed further by what the show's own material establishes about his behavior in the immediate aftermath of Unmortrican, in the real timeline, the events this entire story diverges from. He takes the Omega device schematics, confirmed directly, not as a tool of conquest, but explicitly as a deterrent, insurance to keep Rick C-137 and Morty Smith away from him, stating plainly that he mostly just wants to be left alone. He even hints, in the real episode, that he might have use for Rick again someday, a detail that, in the timeline the audience actually watched, plays as a low-key, unsettling threat, evidence that his commitment to solitude is more conditional and more strategic than it initially appears, that he's willing to reach back into the world he claims to want no part of, if it serves a specific enough purpose. That detail matters enormously for this story, because it means the character was never, even in the real timeline, quite as purely committed to total isolation as his rhetoric about not needing a Robin might suggest. He wants freedom from structures he doesn't control. He does not, by his own confirmed behavior, want freedom from every single interaction with anyone else in the multiverse, provided the terms of that interaction are set by him rather than imposed on him, which is precisely the door Rick Prime, strapped to a chair with his own backups burning, correctly or incorrectly, managed to find and push through. Because here is the uncomfortable structural truth underneath everything Evil Morty has ever done, the one gap in an otherwise airtight, self-protective philosophy that the show never directly names, but leaves sitting in plain sight across every appearance this character makes. Every single relationship in his confirmed history has positioned him as a variable inside someone else's system. His own Rick used him as a resource before he neurologically shut that Rick down. The Citadel wanted him as a president to legitimize a structure he despised. Rick C-137 brought him along on the hunt for Prime, specifically because his intelligence was operationally useful for tracking a target that had eluded C-137 for decades. Even Morty Smith, the closest thing to a genuine peer this character has ever interacted with, relates to him across their limited shared appearances, with a mixture of fear and wary utility, rather than anything resembling equal footing. Evil Morty has spent his entire confirmed existence being managed, used, feared, or hunted. He has never once, in any appearance the show has given him, been offered a seat at a table by someone treating him as a genuine equal rather than as a threat to be contained or a tool to be leveraged. Rick Prime, restrained, bleeding, seconds from either death or escape, is the first being in this character's entire history to do exactly that. Never been a sidekick guy, he says, but I'm starting to see the value. Batman and Robin. It is, on its surface, exactly the kind of offer Evil Morty's entire established philosophy should reject instantly and completely. Because it is, structurally, another attempt to fold him into a relationship with someone more powerful than him. But it is also, And this is the fracture the real timeline never has to grapple with, because Evil Morty says no in 4 flat words and moves on. An offer that is genuinely different in kind from every other relationship this character has ever been inside. Prime is not offering subordination. He is not offering the position of a tool to be used and discarded. He is, whether sincerely or as a calculated manipulation, built from his own confirmed reading of a mind he correctly recognizes as a mirror of his own capability, offering partnership between equals, the one configuration of relationship Evil Morty has never once been extended in his entire confirmed existence. That is the mind Rick Prime just recruited. Not a villain looking for a mentor, not a power-hungry opportunist looking for a shortcut to conquest. A being who has spent his entire life engineering his way out of every structure that ever tried to use him, encountering, for the first time, an offer that does not ask him to be used at all. Chapter 4. The lair is dying around them. Whatever power source Rick Prime built this place on is failing in slow, uneven pulses. Lights flickering along corridors that were, 20 minutes earlier, a controlled and hostile environment designed to trap and kill exactly the kind of intruders who are now stumbling their way back out of it. Rick C-137 is upright, barely, one arm slung over Morty's shoulder, the stim injector still hanging loose from a vein in his forearm, because neither of them thought to remove it in the chaos of getting out. He is not thinking clearly. He knows this about himself even as it's happening, some detached, analytical corner of his mind, still cataloging the situation, even while the rest of him runs purely on adrenaline and a rage that hasn't caught up yet to what it's actually looking at. He watched Rick Prime, restrained, beaten, seconds from death, stand up and walk away with the single most dangerous being to ever escape the central finite curve at his side. He watched it happen while he was unconscious, revived not in time to stop it, only in time to witness the tail end of an arrangement that had already been finalized before he was even capable of forming a coherent sentence. Morty is talking, has been talking actually, for the last several minutes, a steady, nervous stream of words that Rick is only catching about half of. Something about the extraction point, something about whether Rick can walk on his own, something about whether they should try to follow the yellow signature Prime and Evil Morty left through when they portaled out. Rick doesn't answer any of it directly. He's still processing the geography of what just happened, still running the sequence backward, trying to locate the exact moment it went wrong, and there's a specific, bitter irony sitting underneath that effort that he hasn't fully let himself feel yet. The plan worked. Every single piece of the plan that mattered, tracking Prime, cornering him, beating him into submission, worked exactly the way it was supposed to. The only variable that failed was the one variable Rick never once considered needed accounting for, because in every version of this story he's replayed in his head across the decades of hunting that led to this room. Evil Morty was a complication to be managed, a tool to be used, not a second front that could open up entirely on its own, independent of anything Rick himself did or didn't do. They make it back to the ship. This part of the sequence, grounded firmly in what the show has established about Rick's engineering across 7 seasons, is not difficult in the purely technical sense. Rick's vehicles are built with the same paranoid redundancy as everything else he makes, designed to function even when their pilot is severely compromised, and the autopilot systems get them off the ground and clear of the collapsing lair with a margin of safety that has nothing to do with either Rick or Morty's current state, and everything to do with how thoroughly Rick over-engineers every piece of technology he's ever built for exactly this kind of scenario. It's once they're actually airborne, once the immediate physical danger has receded enough that neither of them has to focus purely on staying alive, that the silence sets in, and it's a specific kind of silence, the kind the show has used before, in quieter, heavier moments across its run, the kind that comes right before a character has to actually say the thing they've been avoiding saying. Morty breaks it first, because he almost always does in moments like this, because for all the trauma and complication layered into his relationship with Rick, he has never once, across any confirmed appearance in the show, been able to sit comfortably inside a silence that he suspects is hiding something his grandfather needs to hear. He asks, carefully, whether Rick remembers what happened, whether he remembers waking up, and Rick, staring out at the drifting debris field of whatever dimension they're currently crossing through, says nothing for long enough that Morty almost repeats the question before Rick finally answers, flat, controlled, in the specific voice this character uses when he is working very hard to sound like he isn't feeling anything at all. He says he remembers enough. What he remembers, pieced together across the fragments he actually witnessed, and the details Morty fills in for him over the next several minutes of increasingly uncomfortable conversation, is this. He was down. Prime had him beaten before the fight even reached its final stage, a detail that costs Rick something internally every time he has to acknowledge it. Because this is a man whose entire identity is built around never being the one who loses, and losing to Rick Prime specifically, the one being in the multiverse this character has spent decades constructing his whole psychology around eventually defeating, carries a weight none of his other confirmed defeats across the show ever have. Morty was down too, though less severely. And it was Morty, not evil Morty, who found a way to revive him, scavenging a stim injector off the floor of a room that was actively falling apart around them, and using it with a clumsy, desperate improvisation that, by every account Morty gives him, barely worked at all. Rick listens to this part of the account with an expression that doesn't fully register until later, an expression Morty will describe much later, in a moment this story hasn't reached yet, as something closer to shock than gratitude, though the two aren't as far apart in this specific man as they might be in anyone else. Because here is the thing sitting underneath this exchange that the show itself has built the entire foundation for, across everything already covered about this character's psychology. Rick C-137's entire emotional architecture, established repeatedly and confirmed across multiple seasons, is organized around the terror of powerlessness, specifically the terror of watching something terrible happen to someone he loves and being unable to stop it, the precise terror that defined the worst day of his life, in a garage in a dimension that no longer technically exists in the way it once did. He'd never admit it out loud, not in this moment, not with Morty sitting 3 feet away, watching him with the specific nervous attentiveness of a kid who has learned to read his grandfather's silences for danger. But something in Rick recalibrates in that shuttle, something that will quietly reshape the entire dynamic between them for the rest of this story. In the timeline this story diverges from, Rick wakes up owing his continued existence to evil Morty, and that debt, however much Rick resents it, however much he'd never frame it that way out loud, sits underneath every subsequent interaction between the two of them. Here, there is no such debt to the enemy. There is only Morty, improvising with stolen medical tech in a collapsing lair, refusing to let his grandfather die on the floor, while two of the multiverse's most dangerous minds negotiated 20 feet away without either of them sparing him a glance. Rick doesn't say thank you. That's not how this works. Not yet, maybe not ever, in the way Morty might actually want to hear it, but something shifts. Confirmed repeatedly, across the show's own material, this is a man capable of recognizing genuine partnership when it's placed directly in front of him, even if he almost never manages to say so cleanly. He looks at Morty for a long moment, and what passes between them isn't words. It's the specific, wordless acknowledgement the show has used before, in its quieter moments. The scrambled eggs comment reframed into a single held glance in a dying ship over an unnamed dimension. Then the moment passes. Because it has to. Because Rick is not built to sit inside sincerity for longer than a few seconds before something in him needs to move again. And what moves him this time is the return of the rage that's been building underneath the shock since the moment he first saw Prime standing free. He asks Morty, flatly, which direction the yellow portal went. Morty tells him he doesn't know, that it closed before either of them could get a clean reading on the exit coordinates, that whatever Prime and evil Morty are running toward now, it isn't anywhere Rick's ship is currently equipped to follow. And Rick, staring out at the dimension sliding past the viewport, says nothing for a long time, long enough that Morty starts to think the conversation is over, before Rick finally speaks again, quiet, certain, in a voice that carries none of the performance this character usually wraps around anything that matters to him. He says they'll find them. Not someday. Not eventually. He says it like a fact already established. Like the hunt never actually ended. Like it just changed shape. Chapter 5. The question sitting at the center of this entire diverging timeline is not whether Rick C-137 wants to keep hunting Rick Prime. The show has already answered that question definitively, decades before Unmortrican ever aired, across every piece of confirmed backstory establishing exactly what this man did with his life after Diane and young Beth died in that garage. He built his first portal gun from scratch, driven purely by the need to find the man responsible. He crossed dimensions. He killed other Ricks he mistakenly believed might be Prime, a detail confirmed directly in the show's own material, connecting this period of his life to the eventual founding of the Citadel of Ricks, born partly out of the chaos his hunt generated as he collided with version after version of himself across a section of the multiverse that had, at that point, no organizing structure at all. He spent decades, not months, not years, decades, in that state, before the central finite curve was even built, before the citadel existed, before any of the infrastructure that would eventually define the show's entire mythology was in place. The hunt is not a phase this character passed through. It is the foundational activity of his entire adult existence, the gravitational center every other choice he's made, the central finite curve, the alcoholism, the walls, the decades spent unable to fully attach to anything else, orbits around. So the real question this chapter has to answer isn't whether he keeps hunting, it's what keeping hunting actually does to him now, in this specific altered timeline, where the hunt didn't simply continue unresolved the way it did for decades before Unmortrican. It ended. It ended completely, decisively, with Prime beaten and restrained, and seconds from death. The exact ending this character has spent his entire adult life working toward, and then it was taken away from him, not through Prime's cunning, not through some failure of Rick's own preparation, but through a decision made by someone else entirely, in a room Rick wasn't even conscious for. That distinction matters enormously, and it's worth being precise about why, because it changes the entire psychological texture of what comes next. Consider what actually happens to Rick C-137 in the real timeline, the one this story diverges from, immediately after he finally kills Prime. The show is explicit about this, confirmed directly across the events following Unmortrican. He does not feel victorious. He does not feel healed. Confirmed in the show's own material, he falls back into drinking heavily in the aftermath, loses direction entirely, becomes a man adrift, because the one engine that had kept him moving for decades, revenge, the hunt, the forward momentum of having a single, all-consuming purpose, even if that purpose was fundamentally a dark one, is simply gone. Diane is still dead. His Beth, the version of her who died in the original bombing, is still dead. Prime being gone changes none of it. It was never actually going to. The revenge was never capable of filling the hole it was built to distract him from, and killing Prime, rather than resolving that fact, exposes it completely, stripping away the last coping mechanism that had let him avoid sitting with the reality of what he'd actually lost. The show confirms this collapse directly, and it confirms just as directly what pulls him back from it. Not a breakthrough, not therapy, not some hard-won internal resolution. Morty. Simply Morty, continuing to be present, continuing to need him and be needed by him, giving Rick a reason to keep existing that has nothing to do with revenge or alcohol or being the smartest being in any given room. Now project that same psychological structure onto this altered timeline, where the hunt doesn't resolve at all, where Prime doesn't die, where the revenge that has organized Rick's entire adult life since the day he lost his family gets interrupted at the exact moment it should have concluded, snatched away by a decision made by a 14-year-old with a mechanical eye, who Rick has spent this entire hunt treating as, at best, a useful and dangerous complication. This is, in a very specific sense, worse for Rick than either outcome the show has actually shown the audience. It's worse than the real timeline's hollow victory, because at least that hollow victory came with the thing Rick spent decades believing he needed, Prime's death, even if that death didn't deliver the emotional resolution he was actually hoping for underneath it. And it's worse than simple failure, the kind Rick has experienced plenty of times across his decades of hunting before this confrontation. Because failure that leaves the target dead, or vanished, at least allows the hunt to continue in the shape it's always taken. Rick alone, chasing Prime alone, the two of them locked in the specific two-person configuration that has defined this conflict since the day it began. What happened in that layer breaks that configuration entirely, and it's worth naming exactly how, because the shape of the threat itself has now fundamentally changed in a way the show's own established rules about power and capability make genuinely difficult for Rick to process. He is no longer hunting a single, isolated, if terrifyingly capable being who operates alone by nature and by choice, confirmed across every piece of the show's own characterization of Prime as someone who abandoned every relationship he's ever had, rather than build lasting alliances with anyone. He is now hunting a partnership between two of the most dangerous minds the show's mythology has ever produced, one of whom, confirmed across every appearance Evil Morty has ever made, is specifically, uniquely skilled at exactly the kind of structural, engineering-based problem-solving that could allow Prime's raw capability to finally have the kind of strategic scaffolding it's never needed before. because Prime has never before had a partner intelligent enough to actually contribute something beyond raw force. Grief channeled into a hunt is, as established across everything this analysis has already covered about Rick's psychology, easier to carry than grief on its own. It gives shape to pain that would otherwise simply sit there, unbearable and directionless. But a hunt that keeps almost concluding, and then reopening, over and over, across decades, is a specific and cumulative kind of damage, and the show has already demonstrated exactly how corrosive that pattern is even in its resolved form, in the collapse that follows Prime's actual death in the real timeline. Imagine that collapse, but without the death ever landing. Imagine the alcoholism the show has confirmed as this character's primary coping mechanism, deepening not because the hunt ended and left a hole behind, but because the hunt keeps almost ending and then reopening, each near miss a fresh wound, layered directly on top of the last one, with no resolution ever actually arriving to let any of it scar over. This is where the show's own confirmed pattern with Rick becomes genuinely useful for projecting forward, because it has shown this exact cycle before, on a smaller scale, in Season 6, when a portal fluid reset briefly sent Rick Prime back to his home dimension, and the Diane AI Rick had built pointed out, directly, that the hunt could begin again. Confirmed in the show's own material, Rick nearly went back to it immediately, nearly let the entire machinery of decades of pursuit reactivate itself the instant the possibility reopened. And it was Morty, specifically Morty, who talked him out of it, who gave him a reason not to let the hunt consume the rest of his life the way it had already consumed the majority of it. That is the confirmed mechanism this story is now built to test at a scale the show itself never had to test it at. Because in this timeline, Morty isn't just talking Rick out of reopening a hunt that had briefly and theoretically become possible again. He's sitting next to a grandfather whose hunt never actually closed at all, who watched it get taken from him in real time by a decision he had no power over, and who is now, within hours of that happening, already reorganizing his entire consciousness around resuming it. The answer to whether Rick keeps hunting them isn't really a question the show leaves any room to doubt. Of course he does. Everything about this character's confirmed history says he does. Immediately, completely, with the same all-consuming intensity that built his first portal gun and generated the small war among Ricks that eventually founded the Citadel. What's actually in question, what this entire story is now structured to explore across everything that follows, is what that renewed hunt costs him this time, given that the shape of what he's hunting has changed into something genuinely more dangerous than anything he's faced before. And given that the one person who has always been able to pull him back from the edge of losing himself entirely to this specific obsession is the same person who just, for the first time in the show's entire run, became the one who saved Rick's life, instead of the other way around. Chapter 6. Set the emotional weight of this entire situation aside for one chapter, because there is a colder, more mechanical question sitting underneath everything covered so far, and it deserves to be answered on its own terms before the story moves forward into the emotional and strategic fallout of Rick's renewed hunt. Could Rick, C-137, even at full strength, even with every advantage his own established capability provides, actually defeat Rick Prime and Evil Morty working together? Not eventually, not through some contrived plot mechanism, but as an honest, tactical assessment built entirely from what the show has confirmed about what each of these three beings can actually do. Start with Rick C-137's own confirmed capabilities, because they're substantial, and it would be a mistake to understate them just because this analysis is about to spend a significant amount of time explaining why the combination facing him now represents a genuinely different tier of threat. This is a man who built his first portal gun entirely from scratch, without guidance, purely out of grief and rage, and who has, across the confirmed events of the show's entire run, demonstrated engineering capability on par with any other Rick across the central finite curve. A curve, it's worth remembering, entirely populated by versions of himself specifically selected for guaranteed intellectual supremacy in whatever dimension they occupy. He is confirmed across multiple seasons to be capable of building weapons of extraordinary sophistication, essentially on the fly, of outthinking entire governmental and military structures, of surviving encounters with beings of near godlike capability through some combination of preparation, improvisation, and sheer bloody-minded refusal to accept defeat as a final outcome. And critically, in Unmore-Trick in itself, he actually does defeat Rick Prime, decisively, brutally, with his bare hands, in the timeline this story diverges from. That is not a small data point. Whatever changed in this altered version of events, it wasn't Rick's own capability. He beat Prime once, fully, on his own terms, with Morty and Evil Morty both contributing to weakening Prime beforehand, but Rick delivering the actual killing blow himself. Now set that against what Rick Prime alone represents, because even before factoring in Evil Morty at all, Prime is confirmed across the show's own material to be a genuinely different category of threat than almost anything else the series has produced. He is the origin point of the entire Rick lineage, as far as the show's mythology ever establishes, the inventor of interdimensional travel as the audience understands it being disseminated across the multiverse, and the inventor of the Omega device, a weapon capable of erasing any individual from the totality of existence, across every version of every dimension simultaneously. His confirmed technological sophistication exceeds what almost any other single Rick across the curve is shown to possess, and his willingness to use that sophistication, without hesitation, without moral friction, without the kind of internal resistance that slows down every other version of Rick the show has ever depicted, means that, in a straight confrontation, he brings capabilities to the table that Rick C-137 simply cannot match one for one. The only reason C-137 was able to beat him in the real timeline at all was a combination of factors that this altered timeline specifically removes. Morty and Evil Morty both weakening him significantly beforehand, Evil Morty specifically incapacitating him and destroying his backup clones so he couldn't simply regenerate and continue the fight indefinitely, and Prime himself, confirmed in the show's own depiction of that confrontation, being caught in a moment of genuine overconfidence, mocking C-137 even as he was losing, treating the confrontation as an intellectual exercise right up until it stopped being one. Strip Evil Morty's contribution out of that equation entirely, redirect it to the other side of the fight instead, and the tactical picture changes completely. Because what Evil Morty brings isn't simply another set of hands in a fight. Confirmed across every appearance he's made in the show, his primary and most dangerous capability has never been physical combat at all. It's structural engineering applied to systems of power. He didn't defeat his own Rick through force. He implanted a device that neurologically suppressed him, a solution built entirely from precise, patient technical understanding of exactly how a Rick's intelligence and control mechanisms function from the inside. He didn't dismantle the Citadel through open confrontation. He infiltrated its political structure over multiple confirmed campaigns, understood its actual operational infrastructure well enough to hijack a portal gun manufacturing facility, and use it to collapse the central finite curve's entire enforcement mechanism from underneath the Council of Ricks, without them seeing the actual threat coming until it was already finished. This is a mind that specializes in exactly the kind of problems C-137 would now be facing, understanding a hostile system well enough to dismantle it from the inside before the system's own defenders even register that an attack is underway. Put those two specific skill sets together, Prime's raw capability and complete absence of moral friction, combined with Evil Morty's structural, engineering-based approach to dismantling systems from within, and you get something the show has never actually depicted before across its entire run, because in every prior confirmed instance of either character operating, they've operated alone. Prime by choice, confirmed repeatedly through his pattern of abandoning every relationship he's ever had, rather than building lasting alliances. Evil Morty by necessity, confirmed through the fact that every prior relationship in his life positioned him as a resource to be managed, rather than a partner to be worked with. Neither of them has ever had access to a genuine peer whose skill set complements rather than duplicates their own. Rick C-137, for all his individual capability, has never had to face a combination like this, because the show's own internal logic has never previously produced one. This is, tactically, where the honest answer to whether Rick could defeat them gets complicated in a way that has nothing to do with underselling his abilities and everything to do with correctly assessing what he'd actually be up against. Alone, working purely on his own resources without support, the answer leans strongly toward no, not because Rick lacks the raw capability to match either of them individually, but because the combination denies him the specific tactical openings that let him win the confrontation in the real timeline. He can't simply outfight Prime the way he did before, because Prime, forewarned by this alliance's very existence, would never again allow himself to be caught alone and overconfident the way he was in Unmortrican. And he can't simply out-engineer or outmaneuver the partnership the way he might outmaneuver Prime alone, because Evil Morty's specific skill set is built exactly for countering that kind of approach, for anticipating structural vulnerabilities and closing them before an opponent even identifies them as weaknesses. What changes the calculation, and what this story is going to spend its remaining chapters actually testing, is whether Rick's confirmed pattern of finding unconventional resources, of drawing on relationships and alliances he doesn't typically rely on, could offset a gap that pure individual capability can't close on its own. The show has demonstrated, repeatedly, across 7 seasons, that Rick's most decisive victories rarely come from simply being the most powerful individual in a given confrontation. They come from preparation, from exploiting a specific weakness an opponent doesn't know is visible, from bringing in help at exactly the right moment, whether that help is Morty, or the Vindicators, or an entire dimension's worth of resources he's spent years cultivating without ever needing them, until precisely this kind of situation arrives. Which means the real answer to whether Rick could defeat Rick Prime and Evil Morty together isn't a simple yes or no built purely from comparing raw stats between 3 characters. It's a question of whether Rick is willing, for the first time in his entire confirmed history of hunting Prime, to accept that this fight cannot be won the way every other fight in his life has been won, alone, through sheer force of intellect and improvisation, and whether the one relationship that's already changed in this timeline, his renewed and reframed dependence on Morty, not as a tool or a brainwave shield, but as the person who actually saved his life this time, might be the exact structural shift his entire approach to this hunt now requires. Chapter 7. Wherever Prime and Evil Morty actually went when that yellow portal closed behind them, the show's own established rules about the multiverse make one thing clear before this story even has to invent anything. It's somewhere Rick C-137 cannot easily follow, because yellow portals, confirmed directly through Evil Morty's exit at the end of Rick Mirai Jack, do not travel through the same restricted infrastructure that every green portal, every standard Rick's portal gun across the entire central finite curve, is locked into. Green portals guarantee a destination inside the walled section of the multiverse, where some version of Rick Sanchez remains dominant. Yellow portals, confirmed by the simple fact that the show has never depicted anywhere they lead, go somewhere else entirely, somewhere outside that guarantee, somewhere the audience has never been shown, and Rick C-137, by the internal logic of his own technology, has no confirmed way to reach, without first solving a problem he has never previously needed to solve, because he built the wall specifically so he'd never need to. This is the first and most important thing that happens to this new alliance almost immediately, and it's worth sitting with the practical reality of it before moving into anything more dramatic, because it reframes what kind of partnership this actually is at the very start. Rick Prime has spent, by every confirmed detail the show provides, an extended and largely unaccounted for stretch of his existence, operating entirely alone, outside any structure, answerable to no one, building weapons and technology in isolation, with no need to explain his reasoning or defer to anyone else's judgment. That is not a minor detail about his personality. It's confirmed, repeatedly, as close to the defining structural fact of how he lives. He abandoned his own family without hesitation, the moment they became an obstacle to something he wanted more. He built the Omega device and used it on every version of Diane across the multiverse, not as part of any larger campaign or alliance, but unilaterally, as a solution to a problem he identified and solved entirely on his own terms. Every single confirmed piece of Prime's behavior across the show describes a being who does not build things with other people. He builds things, and other people either benefit from the fallout or get erased by it. So when this story asks what the first thing Prime and Evil Morty actually build together looks like, it has to first reckon with the fact that Prime building anything together with anyone represents a genuine deviation from every pattern the show has ever established for him, and that deviation needs a real, character-grounded explanation rather than simply being assumed because the plot requires it. The explanation sits in the exact circumstances of how this alliance actually formed, restrained, losing, watching his own backup clones burn out one by one, while a 14-year-old calmly extracted his life's most dangerous secret directly from his mind. Prime has never, in any confirmed appearance across the show, been in that specific position before. Every other confrontation he's shown surviving or winning across his history involves him holding the advantage, operating from a position of total control. Unmortrican itself, even in the real timeline where he ultimately dies, shows him entering that confrontation from a position of overwhelming strength, mocking C-137 even while losing, treating the fight as an intellectual exercise right up until the moment it stops being survivable. This altered timeline catches him at the single most vulnerable moment the show has ever depicted him in, and the offer he makes to Evil Morty in that moment isn't, this analysis has to be honest, purely strategic calculation performed from a position of comfortable superiority. It's closer to the first genuinely reactive decision this character has made in his entire confirmed existence. A being whose operating pattern has always been total self-sufficiency, suddenly and completely out of options, recognizing in the person calmly dismantling him the only available path back to relevance. That distinction matters enormously for understanding what he's willing to build with Evil Morty afterward, because a partnership formed out of genuine, confirmed vulnerability operates under different rules than a partnership formed from a position of strength. Prime cannot, in the immediate aftermath of this alliance's formation, simply dictate terms the way every other relationship in his confirmed history has operated. He needs Evil Morty, at least in this specific window, more than Evil Morty needs him, and Prime, for all his confirmed emptiness of ordinary emotional attachment, is not confirmed anywhere in the show to be stupid about power dynamics. He built an entire weapon specifically to solve the problem of grieving Rick's generating operational inconvenience for him. He understands leverage. He understands exactly how fragile his position is in the minutes immediately following his own near death, and the first thing he actually proposes building with Evil Morty reflects that fragility directly, rather than reflecting some grander ambition toward conquest or supremacy that the character's established psychology doesn't actually support at this specific moment. What he proposes, in the hours immediately following their escape from the collapsing lair, is defense. Not expansion, not a plan to seize control of anything, not the kind of sweeping villainous ambition a lesser version of this story might have reached for instinctively. Prime, still recovering, still without his backup clones, still acutely aware that Rick C-137 is somewhere out there with every reason and every confirmed capability to resume the hunt immediately, wants a stronghold. Somewhere outside the reach of green portal technology entirely, built using Evil Morty's specific, confirmed expertise in exactly the kind of dimensional engineering that let him hijack the Citadel's own infrastructure and collapse the central finite curve from underneath the Council of Ricks without them seeing it coming. Evil Morty, for his part, brings something to this specific project that Prime, working alone for however long he's been working alone, has apparently never fully solved himself. A genuinely stable method for isolating a location entirely outside the accessible multiverse's standard travel infrastructure. The exact same principle that let him vanish through that yellow portal at the end of Rick Mirai Jack into a space no green portal has ever been shown reaching. This is the first thing they actually build together, confirmed by nothing in canon, because none of this happened in the real timeline, but grounded entirely in capabilities the show has separately confirmed each of them possesses. A location constructed jointly, using Prime's raw technological sophistication and total absence of moral restriction on what he's willing to do to make it work, combined with Evil Morty's structural expertise in exactly the kind of dimensional isolation that makes a place genuinely, verifiably unreachable by conventional means. It's not a throne room. It's not a monument to either of their egos. It's a bunker, built by two beings whose combined confirmed history gives them every reason to expect that the single most relentless hunter either of them has ever encountered is, at this exact moment, somewhere out there, reorganizing his entire existence around finding them again. And here is where the fracture that will eventually define this entire alliance first becomes visible, quietly, in the earliest hours of its existence, long before either of them would ever describe it in these terms. Prime wants the stronghold purely as a defensive measure, a place to recover, rebuild his backup infrastructure, and eventually resume operating with the total self-sufficiency that's defined his entire existence up to this point. He is not, by anything the show has confirmed about his psychology, building this place because he values having a partner. He's building it because right now, in this specific and temporary window of vulnerability, having a partner happens to be useful, and Prime, confirmed repeatedly to operate purely on frictionless calculation rather than attachment, will drop that usefulness the instant it stops applying. The same way he dropped every other relationship in his confirmed history, the instant it stopped serving him. Evil Morty, watching him work, watching the specific way Prime approaches this project, purely functional, purely defensive, with no interest whatsoever in anything beyond the immediate problem of survival, is doing what he has done in every single confirmed appearance across the show. He's evaluating, not trusting. Confirmed across everything already established about this character's psychology, He does not extend genuine trust easily, if he extends it at all, and the specific way Prime approaches this joint project, treating the alliance as a purely instrumental arrangement, rather than as anything resembling the genuine partnership he seemed to be offering back in that ruined lair, is data. Evil Morty is not naive. He recognized the offer of equal footing for what it was worth when it was made. The first time in his confirmed existence, anyone had extended him that specific kind of recognition. But recognizing the appeal of an offer and trusting the being making it are two entirely different operations, for a mind built the way his has been built, by everything the show has confirmed about his history. He watches Prime work purely for himself, watches the specific coldness with which Prime approaches every decision, even inside a project they're supposedly building together, and files it away. The same careful, structural evaluation that let him recognize exactly what his own Rick was doing to him, long before he did anything about it. The stronghold gets built. It works, at least in the immediate term, exactly the way both of them need it to. But it's worth naming clearly, before this story moves any further into the operational consequences of this alliance, that what's being constructed here isn't just a physical location outside the reach of Rick C-137's hunt. It's the first concrete evidence, visible to both parties, even if neither says it aloud, that this partnership is built on two fundamentally incompatible foundations. Prime treats it as a tool, temporary, purely functional, ready to be discarded the instant it stops serving his purposes, the same way he's treated every relationship in his entire confirmed history. Evil Morty treats it as a test, watching, evaluating, gathering exactly the kind of information he'll need later to determine whether the offer made to him in that ruined lair was ever actually sincere, or whether he simply walked, with his eyes open, into precisely the kind of structure he spent his entire existence engineering his way out of. Chapter 8. Every alliance the show has ever depicted, whether between Ricks, between factions of the Citadel, or between Rick and any of the outside forces he's occasionally worked with across 7 seasons, eventually reveals the actual philosophy underneath the convenience that formed it. This one is no different, and the fault line running underneath Prime and Evil Morty's partnership isn't hidden, or subtle, or something this story has to manufacture out of nothing. It's built directly out of 2 philosophies the show has already, separately, fully confirmed for each character, and those 2 philosophies, laid side by side, do not actually point in the same direction, no matter how useful they might currently be to each other. Start with Rick Prime's confirmed worldview, because it is, across every appearance he's made, and every piece of backstory the show has attached to him, remarkably consistent, remarkably simple, and genuinely different from almost every other character across the entire series. Prime's worldview, confirmed through his own actions, rather than through any speech he's ever given explaining it, because this is not a character who explains himself, is built on a single organizing principle. Attachment is friction, and friction is inefficiency, and inefficiency is the only thing in the entire multiverse that actually threatens a being of his capability. Everything else, confirmed across his entire documented history, follows directly from that principle. He abandoned his own family the instant the portal gun offered him something more efficient than staying. He killed C-137's family not out of hatred, but because a version of himself saying no represented an unresolved inefficiency in his plans. He built the Omega device, and used it to erase every Diane across the entire multiverse, not out of any specific animosity toward any of them, but because grieving Rick's hunting him represented an ongoing operational cost, and erasing the source of the grief was, by his own frictionless logic, simply the most efficient available solution. Prime's supremacy, and the show is careful to frame it this way, is not achieved through raw intelligence alone, because every other Rick across the central finite curve is confirmed to possess essentially identical raw intelligence. His supremacy comes specifically from the absence of everything that slows other Ricks down: grief, love, loyalty, the entire category of attachment that makes ordinary versions of Rick Sanchez, including C-137, hesitate, second-guess, or sacrifice efficiency for the sake of something that matters to them emotionally. Prime doesn't have anything that matters to him emotionally, and that absence, confirmed repeatedly across the show's own material, is the entire source of his power. Now set that directly against Evil Morty's confirmed worldview, which the show articulates most explicitly through his own words in the Rick Mirai Jack finale, and which is built on a foundation that looks, on the surface, almost compatible with Prime's, but is actually organized around something close to its philosophical opposite. Evil Morty's entire confirmed ideology, expressed through the central finite curve speech and through every action he's taken across his appearances, from neurologically disabling his own Rick, to dismantling the citadel from within, to destroying the wall around infinity entirely, is built around freedom, specifically defined as the absence of imposed structure. He does not want supremacy the way Prime wants supremacy. He has never once confirmed, across any appearance in the show, to have expressed interest in ruling over anyone, in being recognized as the most capable being in any given room, in the specific kind of dominance through capability that defines Prime's entire self-concept. What he wants, confirmed through the very specific and deliberate choice he makes at the end of Rick Mirai Jack, destroying the curve, rather than seizing control of it, is the removal of every structure that could ever again position him as subordinate to someone else's system. Freedom, to Evil Morty, is not the ability to dominate. It's the absence of anyone with the ability to dominate him. Lay those two philosophies next to each other, and the surface compatibility that made this alliance possible in the first place starts to show its cracks almost immediately. Both of them, confirmed across their respective histories, reject the ordinary emotional attachments that define most of the show's other characters. Both of them are willing to make decisions with a coldness that horrifies almost everyone else in the multiverse. Both of them, crucially, are individually capable of operating entirely outside the structures other beings depend on. Prime through raw technological supremacy and total self-sufficiency. Evil Morty through structural intelligence and a demonstrated willingness to dismantle any system that tries to contain him. That shared capacity for coldness, for operating without the friction of attachment, is exactly what let Prime correctly identify Evil Morty as a mirror of his own capability in that ruined lair. And it's exactly what let Evil Morty pause, for the first time in his entire confirmed existence, on an offer he should have, by every established pattern of his own behavior, rejected instantly. But supremacy and freedom, despite both being organized around the rejection of ordinary attachment, are not actually pointed toward the same destination, and the show has already, separately, confirmed exactly why. Prime's philosophy requires a hierarchy. It requires, structurally, that he remain the most capable being in whatever room he occupies, because his entire self-concept, confirmed through every action he's taken across the show, is built on the specific comfort of never again being caught in the position of powerlessness that defined the one moment in his life the show ever confirms mattered to him at all, watching a version of himself say no, and having to live with that refusal, rather than simply removing it. Evil Morty's philosophy, by direct contrast, requires the absence of hierarchy entirely, at least any hierarchy that could position him as subordinate. He didn't destroy the central finite curve to become its new ruler. He destroyed it because the very existence of a structure, with a top and a bottom, regardless of who currently occupied the top, represented exactly the kind of system he'd spent his entire life trying to escape. Which means, underneath every practical functional element of the alliance covered in the previous chapter, the shared stronghold, the shared defensive posture against Rick C-137's inevitable renewed hunt, there is a structural incompatibility sitting quietly at the foundation of this entire partnership. One that neither party has any confirmed incentive to name out loud yet, because right now, in the immediate aftermath of their escape, the practical benefits of working together still outweigh the philosophical tension underneath it. But the tension is there, and it's worth being precise about exactly how it will eventually manifest, because it's built entirely from confirmed character behavior, rather than from anything this story has to invent. Prime, given enough time, given enough recovery, given the return of the confidence and self-sufficiency that's defined every other stretch of his existence, is going to want the hierarchy back. Not necessarily through betrayal in any dramatic telegraphed sense, but simply through the gradual confirmed pattern of behavior that's defined every one of his relationships up to this point. Treating the partnership as instrumental, treating Evil Morty's contributions as useful, rather than as evidence of genuine equal standing. Slowly reverting to the exact operating mode that's defined his entire existence. Total self-sufficiency, total control, total absence of anyone whose judgment he has to actually weigh against his own. He offered Batman and Robin in that lair because he was, for the first and possibly only time in his confirmed history, genuinely without options. The moment he has options again, the moment the stronghold is secure and his backup infrastructure is rebuilt, and the immediate threat of Rick C-137's revenge feels manageable rather than urgent, the The show's own established psychology for this character predicts, with real confidence, that the offer of genuine partnership starts quietly eroding back towards something closer to what every other relationship in Prime's confirmed history has actually looked like. And Evil Morty, confirmed across every single appearance he's ever made to be exactly the kind of mind that notices structural shifts like this before almost anyone else could, is not going to miss it when it happens. This is, after all, a being who recognized the exact contours of his own Rick's control mechanisms with enough precision to disable them surgically. A being who campaigned for the Citadel's presidency specifically because he understood its actual, functional power structure well enough to know exactly which lever to pull to dismantle it from the inside. He is not going to be caught off guard by Prime slowly reverting to hierarchy, because he was never fully trusting the arrangement in the first place, confirmed directly by his behavior during the construction of the stronghold in the previous chapter, watching, evaluating, gathering data, rather than extending anything resembling genuine faith. Which means the alliance between Rick Prime and Evil Morty, however useful it is in the immediate term, however genuinely unprecedented it is for both of them to have found, for the first time, a peer whose capability actually matches their own, is built on a foundation that the show's own established psychology for both characters predicts cannot hold indefinitely. Not because either of them is lying about their initial intentions. Prime's offer in that lair was, by every reasonable reading of his desperate circumstances, sincere in the narrow, immediate sense. Evil Morty's decision to accept it was, by every reasonable reading of his own confirmed history, a genuine and unprecedented departure from his usual pattern of total isolation. But sincerity, in a moment of crisis and stability over time, are different things, and the specific philosophies underneath this alliance, supremacy through hierarchy on one side, freedom through the absence of hierarchy on the other, are not compatible destinations, no matter how similar the road there might look in the beginning. The question this fracture leaves hanging over everything that follows isn't whether it eventually surfaces. Given who these two beings are, confirmed across everything the show has ever shown about either of them, it's not a question of if. It's a question of what triggers it, and what Evil Morty, the one member of this alliance whose entire confirmed existence has been organized around recognizing exactly this kind of structural betrayal before it can trap him, decides to do about it once he sees it clearly enough to act. Chapter 9. Go back to the exact words Rick Prime used inside the Stronghold negotiations, or more precisely, go back to what Evil Morty actually walked away from that ruined lair holding, because it matters enormously for understanding the specific shape of leverage he carries into this alliance from the very first moment. Leverage that exists independently of whatever Prime is offering him, and that he never actually surrenders, no matter how the partnership develops from here. The schematics. Confirmed directly across the real timeline's own events in Unmortrican, Evil Morty scans and downloads the complete specifications for the Omega device, before Prime is ever revived or killed, and confirmed further in the show's own supplementary material, covering the immediate aftermath of that episode. He doesn't simply hold on to that information passively. He explicitly deletes all of Prime's backup clones as part of the same process, ensuring that whatever else happens in that room, Prime cannot simply regenerate and continue operating with the same total self-sufficiency he's relied on for the entirety of his confirmed existence. And confirmed again, in the show's own account of what Evil Morty does with the schematics after walking away in the real timeline, he doesn't use them immediately, doesn't build a second Omega device right away, doesn't turn the most dangerous weapon in the multiverse's confirmed history into an immediate offensive tool. He holds it, purely as deterrent, purely as insurance, a piece of leverage kept in reserve specifically because using it would create exactly the kind of reputation of being capable of erasing anyone from existence at will that would turn him into precisely the kind of universally hunted target Rick Prime himself became the moment other Ricks learned what he was capable of. This detail is the single most important piece of context for understanding what Evil Morty actually wants out of this altered alliance, because it means that from the very first hour of this partnership's existence, he is not walking into it empty-handed, dependent purely on Prime's goodwill or Prime's continued interest in maintaining the arrangement. He is walking into it holding, quite literally, the schematics for the one weapon capable of erasing Rick Prime from the totality of existence, permanently, across every version of himself, in every dimension, with no possibility of the kind of regeneration or backup clone recovery that has apparently defined Prime's approach to his own mortality up to this point. That is not a small thing to be carrying into a room with the single most dangerous being in the show's entire mythology. That is, structurally, the single most significant power reversal available anywhere in this story's premise. And Evil Morty, confirmed repeatedly across every appearance he's ever made, to understand exactly how leverage works, is not a character who would ever walk into this alliance without recognizing precisely what he's holding. Which reframes the entire nature of the partnership in a way worth sitting with directly, because it means the offer Prime made in that lair, and the acceptance Evil Morty extended in return, was never actually a negotiation between a powerful being and a subordinate one, the way it might superficially appear, given Prime's reputation and Evil Morty's confirmed youth relative to the ancient, world-spanning scope of Prime's history. It was, from the very first moment, a negotiation between two beings who each held something the other genuinely needed. Prime needed Evil Morty's structural intelligence and his demonstrated capacity for exactly the kind of dimensional engineering that would let them build a stronghold outside the reach of Rick C-137's confirmed hunting capability. Evil Morty needed nothing from Prime in the same immediate desperate sense, because he already walked out of that lair holding the schematics and the confirmed knowledge that Prime's backups were gone. What he wanted instead, and this is the detail that separates this altered alliance from every other relationship in either character's confirmed history, was something closer to information. Access. The chance to actually observe, up close, over an extended period, the single most capable and most dangerous individual mind the multiverse's mythology has ever produced, and to understand exactly what that mind was capable of, exactly how it operated, exactly where its confirmed weaknesses might actually lie, in a way that no amount of second-hand information gathered from Citadel records or from C-137's own decades of hunting could have ever provided. This is consistent, and it's worth being precise about exactly how consistent, with the confirmed pattern of everything Evil Morty has done across every other appearance in the show. He didn't simply run from his own Rick's control. He studied it closely enough, from the inside, to understand its exact mechanism well enough to disable it surgically. He didn't simply avoid the Citadel's political structure, he ran for its presidency, twice, specifically to gain the kind of intimate, structural understanding of its actual operational vulnerabilities that no outside observer could ever have accessed. Every single major action this character has taken across his confirmed history follows the same underlying pattern: proximity to a threat, sustained and deliberate, specifically in service of eventually understanding that threat well enough to neutralize it permanently, on his own terms, at a moment of his own choosing, rather than in a moment of crisis or desperation. Apply that pattern to this alliance, and the true shape of what Evil Morty actually wants from Rick Prime comes into focus. He is not, despite the surface framing of Batman and Robin that initiated this entire partnership, actually interested in being anyone's sidekick, and he was never confirmed to be, not in the real timeline where he explicitly refuses the offer, and not in this altered timeline where he accepts it either. What he's interested in, consistent with every documented instance of his behavior across the show, is proximity, sustained, deliberate access to the single most dangerous mind in the multiverse's mythology, close enough to observe how it operates, close enough to learn whatever technological or strategic capability Prime possesses that Evil Morty himself doesn't yet have, and close enough, crucially, to eventually identify the exact structural vulnerability that would let him neutralize Prime permanently, the same way he neutralized his own Rick, the same way he neutralized the entire Citadel's power structure, the moment that vulnerability becomes clear enough to act on, and the Alliance stops being useful to him. This is, it's worth being honest about, a genuinely darker read on Evil Morty's motivations than the surface framing of this story's premise might initially suggest. And it deserves to be treated as exactly the kind of possibility his confirmed character supports, rather than softened into something more sympathetic than the evidence actually justifies. Evil Morty is not confirmed anywhere across the show to be capable of, or particularly interested in, genuine long-term loyalty to anyone. His entire confirmed history is a catalog of relationships entered into instrumentally and exited the moment they stopped serving his primary, unwavering objective: permanent freedom from ever again being subordinate to a more powerful structure or individual. Even the moment in the real timeline's Unmortrican where he actually helps Rick and Morty defeat Prime is confirmed, directly in the show's own material, to be motivated by self-preservation rather than loyalty or friendship, joining the fight against Prime specifically once he learns Prime is capable of erasing him the same way he erased every Diane across the multiverse. Evil Morty does not do things for other people. He does things that serve Evil Morty, and the confirmed consistency of that pattern across every single appearance he's ever made in the show means this altered alliance with Prime, however it might look on the surface, should be read through exactly the same lens. Which means the trust question hanging over this partnership isn't actually symmetrical, even though both parties are, on some level, aware they're each holding leverage over the other. Prime, for all his confirmed coldness and total absence of ordinary emotional attachment, does eventually, according to the pattern this story's own Chapter 8 already established, start reverting toward the hierarchical control that's defined every other relationship in his confirmed history, because that reversion is simply what happens once the immediate desperation that produced his original offer fades, and his default operating mode reasserts itself. But Evil Morty was never actually vulnerable to that reversion, the way a genuinely trusting partner would be, because he never extended the kind of trust that reversion would actually betray. He accepted the offer in that lair, not because he believed, in any deep or lasting sense, that Prime was offering him genuine equal standing forever, but because the offer represented, for the first time in his confirmed existence, an opportunity worth the calculated risk of proximity to a being this dangerous, an opportunity to study, to learn, and eventually, when the moment was right, to act on whatever he discovered. Which leaves this alliance in a genuinely unstable position from its very first hour, though neither party would frame it that way yet, because both of them are, by their own separately confirmed psychologies, playing a version of the exact same game. Prime is extracting value from Evil Morty's capability, while planning to eventually revert to the total control he's always operated under. Evil Morty is extracting information and access from Prime's proximity, while planning to eventually act on whatever vulnerability that access reveals. Both of them believe, at least in the earliest hours of this partnership, that they hold the advantage. And the show's own confirmed history for both characters suggests that at least one of them, and likely both of them simultaneously, is going to be proven catastrophically wrong about exactly when that advantage actually gets exercised. Chapter 10. The Citadel of Ricks does not know, in the immediate hours and days following the events in that ruined lair, that anything has changed. This detail matters more than it might initially seem, because it means the political and social structure this story is about to examine is, at the moment this altered timeline begins, still operating under a set of assumptions the show's own confirmed history has already established as false, assumptions the Citadel built its entire post-Rick and Morty Jack recovery around, and this alliance is about to invalidate all of them at once. Start with where the Citadel actually stands by this point in the confirmed timeline. Rick and Morty Jack, confirmed directly in the show's own material, ends with Evil Morty destroying the machine underneath the Citadel that enforces the boundaries of the central finite curve entirely, collapsing the entire infrastructure that gave the Council of Ricks their functional control over which dimensions remained accessible and which didn't. The show confirms, across events depicted in Season 6, that the curve is eventually restored, though the process is treated with a specific and deliberate lack of dramatic weight. Almost as a background fact, the show chooses not to dwell on, a detail that matters for understanding how the Citadel itself processed what happened. The restoration wasn't framed, within the show's own internal logic, as a triumphant recovery. It was framed as a patch, a stopgap measure applied to a wound that never actually healed, consistent with everything this analysis has already covered about how trauma and control operate within this show's mythology. The wall came back up. The fear that drove its original construction never actually went away. Which means the Citadel of Ricks, in the period this altered story is now unfolding across, exists in a state of confirmed, lingering institutional paranoia. They know, because Evil Morty proved it decisively and publicly, that their entire structure of guaranteed supremacy can be dismantled by a single sufficiently capable and sufficiently motivated Morty. They know that the wall they rebuilt is, by its own internal logic, not actually secure in the way the original wall was assumed to be secure before Evil Morty demonstrated otherwise. And they know, or at least the surviving leadership structure knows, confirmed through everything the show has established, about how thoroughly Evil Morty gutted the Citadel's actual operational infrastructure during his second presidency, that whatever version of the Citadel currently exists is running on a fraction of the capability and resources it once possessed, rebuilt in the aftermath of a collapse that exposed exactly how fragile the entire system had always been. Into this specific state of institutional fragility, the reappearance of Rick Prime, confirmed by the Citadel's own established mythology, to be treated as something close to a mythic, almost unspeakable threat, given his role as both the origin point of the entire Rick lineage and the confirmed inventor of a weapon capable of erasing anyone from the totality of existence. Working openly alongside the single Morty, who already proved capable of dismantling their entire structure once before, represents something the Citadel has no established framework for processing. This is not a threat they can categorize using the tools their entire post-curve restoration security apparatus was built around. Every defensive measure the Citadel has developed since Rick and Jack, and the show confirms this restoration involved genuine institutional effort, was built around the specific and narrow assumption that the next major threat to their structure would look something like the last one, an internal Morty exploiting a structural vulnerability from within the system itself. Nothing in that framework accounts for a partnership between the multiverse's most dangerous free agent and the one being who already demonstrated the exact skill set required to dismantle their reconstructed defenses from the outside. This creates a specific and immediate crisis for the Citadel's leadership, and it's worth walking through exactly how that crisis would manifest, given everything the show has confirmed about how this institution actually operates. The Council of Ricks, confirmed across multiple appearances to be an organization built primarily around self-preservation and the maintenance of collective Rick supremacy over the Morty population that supports their entire structural existence, would recognize immediately that this alliance represents an existential threat on two completely separate axes at once. Rick Prime, simply by existing and operating openly again, represents a threat to every individual Rick across the curve, given his confirmed history of treating other versions of himself as expendable the instant they become inconvenient, and given the specific, confirmed fact that the Omega device, or knowledge of how to build it, is now potentially accessible to two beings working in tandem rather than contained within a single, if catastrophically dangerous, individual. And Evil Morty's continued involvement represents a threat to the entire underlying structure the Citadel depends on for its labor force, the confirmed system of manufactured Mortys, harvested across the central finite curve specifically for their useful brainwave patterns. A system Evil Morty already proved, through the events of Rick and Jack, he considers illegitimate enough to destroy entirely, rather than simply escape from personally. The Morty underclass, meanwhile, occupies a genuinely different position in relation to this news. One the show's own established politics around this population make clear should not be assumed to align automatically with the Citadel's institutional panic. Confirmed across the Ricklantis mix-up, the show's most sustained exploration of Citadel society, the Morty population exists in a state of persistent, structural subordination, treated as a labor force, as political props, as an underclass, whose usefulness to the Rick-led power structure is confirmed to be their primary value within the system. This is not a population that has any particular confirmed loyalty to the Council of Ricks, or any specific investment in preserving the current structure of Citadel governance. What complicates their reaction to this specific news, though, is that Evil Morty's own confirmed history with this same population is not straightforwardly heroic either. Confirmed directly in the Ricklantis mix-up, his first presidential campaign explicitly promised reform on behalf of exactly this underclass, and confirmed just as directly, he abandoned that promise the instant it stopped serving his actual, underlying goal of securing permanent personal freedom from Rick control. He shot a fellow Morty, one who had pieced together his history, and confronted him with it, without hesitation, the moment that Morty became an obstacle rather than an ally. The Morty population of the Citadel, to whatever extent word of this new alliance reaches them, has no confirmed reason to view Evil Morty as any kind of liberator, returning to finish what he started. If anything, his own confirmed history gives them every reason to view him with the same wary, calculated distance he extends to almost everyone else. What actually happens across the Citadel in the immediate aftermath of this news, reaching its leadership then, is a specific and internally consistent kind of chaos, built directly from the confirmed institutional psychology the show has already established. The Council of Ricks, confirmed repeatedly to prioritize self-preservation above almost every other consideration, moves immediately toward defensive consolidation, tightening security around the curve's restored boundaries, likely reactivating whatever surveillance and enforcement infrastructure survived Evil Morty's original purge, and almost certainly opening quiet, back-channel communication with Rick C-137 himself. Because whatever else can be said about the current state of relations between C-137 and the Citadel, and the show has established across multiple appearances that this relationship has always been characterized by mutual distrust and periodic uneasy cooperation, he is, At this exact moment, the single individual across the entire multiverse, with the most direct, confirmed, personal stake in seeing this specific alliance destroyed. The Citadel does not need to trust Rick C-137 to recognize that his motivations, at this specific juncture, align almost perfectly with their own institutional survival. This is where the story's political dimension begins to intersect directly with its personal one, because Rick C-137, in the immediate aftermath of the events covered in earlier chapters, is not operating as a fully independent agent hunting Prime and Evil Morty purely through his own resources, the way he did across the decades of hunting that preceded Unmortrican in the original timeline. He is, for reasons this story's later chapters will explore in full, forced into a position where the Citadel's own institutional panic and their own confirmed desperation to see this specific threat neutralized before it can do to their restored structure what Evil Morty already did to their original one, makes them a genuinely useful, if deeply uncomfortable, resource. This is a man whose entire confirmed history includes founding the very Citadel he's now being courted by, and whose entire confirmed relationship with its subsequent leadership has been marked by contempt, described directly in earlier chapters of this analysis as the malcontent, the rogue, the one Rick who refuses full cooperation with the collective structure the rest of his kind built around themselves. The Citadel needs him. He has every confirmed reason to despise what they represent, and somewhere underneath both of those facts sits the specific, uncomfortable truth this altered timeline is now forcing into the open, that the wall Rick C-137 helped build, the wall Evil Morty destroyed once already, the wall the Citadel patched back together in a form the show itself frames as fundamentally fragile, is now facing exactly the kind of coordinated internal and external threat it was never actually built to survive. Chapter 11. Not every faction across the multiverse learns about this alliance through the Citadel's institutional panic, and not every faction that learns about it responds the way the Council of Ricks does. This chapter exists specifically to test how the show's own established secondary characters, the ones the earlier chapters of this analysis have already touched on in passing, would realistically respond to news of this magnitude, grounded entirely in what the show has confirmed about their personalities, their histories, and their specific relationships to Rick C-137, and to the broader mythology this story now threatens to destabilize. Start with Spacebeth, because she occupies a genuinely unique position relative to everything happening in this story, one the show has built carefully across multiple seasons and confirmed in enough detail to make her reaction fully groundable in established character. Spacebeth, confirmed across her introduction and subsequent appearances, is a version of Beth Smith who chose the alternate life offered to her during the events of Season 3's Morty's Mindblowers, a clone swap arrangement where the original Beth stayed home to raise Summer and Morty, while a fully autonomous, combat-capable version of herself went to live an adventurous life across the stars. Confirmed directly through her established characterization, this version of Beth carries none of the confirmed insecurity and self-doubt that defines the Beth who stayed behind, the version whose entire arc across the show is tied up in questions about whether she inherited her father's coldness, whether she's a good mother, whether the life she chose was the right one. Spacebeth is decisive, combat-hardened, and confirmed across her appearances to have a genuinely different relationship with Rick than either version of Jerry or the home Beth, one closer to a working partnership between two people who respect each other's competence, rather than the complicated, unresolved parent-child dynamic that defines Rick's relationship with home Beth. When news of this alliance reaches Spacebeth, and it would, given her established connections across the multiverse and her confirmed willingness to involve herself directly in exactly this kind of high-stakes crisis, her response would be shaped by two confirmed facts about her character that pull in slightly different directions. On one hand, she has genuine, established stakes in Rick C-137's well-being specifically, confirmed across multiple appearances, where she demonstrates real concern for him that goes beyond simple family obligation, positioning her as someone who would recognize immediately what this development means for a man she's watched struggle with the Rick Prime hunt across years of confirmed interaction. On the other hand, Spacebeth is not confirmed anywhere in the show to be someone who processes crisis through hesitation or careful institutional deliberation the way the Citadel's leadership does. She is established, repeatedly, as a woman of direct, immediate action, someone who would hear about Rick Prime's survival and Evil Morty's alliance with him, and respond not by convening a council, or waiting for C-137 to organize a plan, but by moving on her own initiative, gathering whatever resources her own established network across the multiverse provides, and positioning herself to act the moment an opportunity presents itself, whether or not that aligns cleanly with whatever strategy C-137 himself is trying to build. This creates a specific tension worth naming directly, because it's grounded in confirmed character rather than invented for convenience. C-137, confirmed repeatedly across this analysis, to struggle with genuine partnership, confirmed directly through his own admission to Morty that he never made him a true partner, is not a man built to easily accept help, even from someone he trusts and respects as much as Spacebeth. His instinct, consistent with decades of confirmed solo hunting behavior that predates the entire structure of the Citadel and the Curve itself, is to treat this as his fight, the way he's treated every previous stage of the Prime Hunt, as fundamentally his responsibility and his alone. Spacebeth's confirmed independence and refusal to wait for permission means this story now has to account for a version of events where C-137's attempt to keep this hunt contained to himself, and Morty runs directly into a family member who has no confirmed history of respecting that kind of boundary when the stakes are this high. The Vindicators occupy an entirely different position, and their confirmed history with Rick C-137 makes their potential involvement genuinely complicated in a way worth examining carefully, rather than assuming automatically. Confirmed across their introduction and subsequent appearances, the Vindicators are a team of superhero-adjacent beings across the multiverse, whose relationship with Rick has been marked by real friction, including confirmed conflict, where Rick's actions directly led to member casualties and generated lasting resentment from the team's surviving members toward him specifically. This is not a group with any confirmed obligation to help Rick C-137 with anything, let alone a crisis this dangerous, and the show's own established history between them gives every reason to expect that any approach C-137 makes toward the Vindicators for assistance would be met with, at minimum, deep skepticism, and quite possibly outright refusal, grounded entirely in their confirmed grievances against him. What might actually shift that calculation, though, and this is worth grounding carefully in what the show has established about the Vindicators as an organization, rather than simply assuming their personal history with Rick determines everything, is the specific nature of the threat itself. The Vindicators, whatever their confirmed feelings about Rick individually, are established across their appearances as a team organized around responding to exactly the kind of multiversal-scale threats that Rick Prime and Evil Morty working together now represent. A weapon capable of erasing individuals from the totality of existence, in the hands of two of the most capable minds the multiverse has ever produced, is not a threat that maps neatly onto personal grievances against any single individual asking for help. If word of the Omega device's schematics being actively developed or deployed reaches the Vindicators through channels independent of Rick's own outreach, their confirmed institutional purpose gives them genuine reason to mobilize regardless of their feelings toward him personally, creating a scenario where they end up involved in this conflict not because Rick asked for their help, but because the threat itself crosses the specific threshold their organization exists to respond to. Birdperson deserves specific attention here, given how thoroughly the earlier chapters of this analysis have already established the depth and history of his friendship with Rick C-137. Confirmed across the show's own material, Birdperson is the only character consistently shown to see through Rick's performance without needing it explained to him, the friend who translated Wubba Lubba Dub Dub as a genuine cry for help back in Season 1, the relationship built during Rick's early years fighting the Galactic Federation that predates almost everything else in Rick's adult life. His reaction to this news would not be shaped by strategic calculation the way the Citadel's or even the Vindicators' reactions would be. It would be shaped by the same quiet, clear-eyed understanding of Rick that's defined every one of his confirmed appearances, recognizing immediately, and without needing to be told exactly what this development would do to a friend, whose entire psychology, as established across every chapter of this analysis, is organized around the specific terror of being powerless to stop something terrible from happening to the people he loves. Birdperson's confirmed history suggests he would not need convincing to get involved. He would simply show up, the way he's shown up before, because that's what the confirmed pattern of this specific friendship has always looked like. The Council of Ricks and the wider Citadel apparatus, covered in the previous chapter, represent the institutional response to this crisis. Spacebeth, the Vindicators, and Birdperson represent something different. The personal network Rick C137 has built across 7 confirmed seasons of relationships, alliances, and complicated histories, a network that this altered timeline is now forcing into activation, whether Rick wants it activated or not. And this is where the tension established back in Chapter 6's tactical assessment becomes concrete rather than theoretical. That chapter concluded that Rick, working alone, likely cannot defeat a partnership between Rick Prime and Evil Morty, and that his only realistic path to victory would require accepting help in a way his entire confirmed history has made him fundamentally resistant to doing. What this chapter establishes is that the help exists, confirmed across the show's own established relationships and factions, ready, and in several cases, actively mobilizing, whether or not Rick has asked for it. The question this story now has to carry forward isn't whether resources exist to help him close the gap between his individual capability and the threat now arrayed against him. It's whether Rick C137, a man whose defining psychological wound is built around the terror of being powerless to protect the people he loves, can actually let any of them get close enough to that fight to help him, or whether the same walls that have defined his entire confirmed character across this analysis will end up costing him the one advantage that might actually let him win. Chapter 12. Morty Smith wakes up on the third morning back at the house in dimension C137, still technically not his home dimension in any biological sense. Still, as covered in earlier chapters of this analysis, a life built out of the wreckage of a family C137 constructed after abandoning his own hunt for a Diane that no longer exists anywhere in the multiverse, and finds Rick already gone from the garage. This detail matters, and it's worth sitting with exactly why it matters before moving into the practical mechanics of what Rick is actually doing during these missing hours. Because the show has established, across everything covered in earlier chapters about the aftermath of genuine crisis in this family, a specific and confirmed pattern for how Rick behaves when he's trying to keep Morty out of danger versus how he behaves when he genuinely wants Morty's involvement. Rick disappearing from the garage without explanation, without the usual gruff, half-sincere invitation to come along, is not neutral. It's a decision, and Morty, having spent years learning to read exactly this kind of silence, understands immediately what it means. Rick is trying to do this alone. This is worth grounding directly in the confirmed shift established back in Chapter 4, because the entire premise of this altered timeline hinges on a single structural change to Rick and Morty's relationship, one that earlier chapters of this analysis have already built carefully. In the real timeline, Rick's life is saved by Evil Morty, an enemy exercising calculated mercy for his own strategic reasons, and Rick wakes up, owing nothing emotionally to anyone in that room, free to process the entire confrontation purely through the lens of unfinished revenge. In this altered timeline, Rick wakes up to his own grandson's face, to a stim injector jammed in clumsily by a 14-year-old who refused to let him die on a collapsing floor, while the two most dangerous beings in the multiverse negotiated a few feet away. That difference, confirmed in Chapter 4 to register with Rick even through the fog of adrenaline and shock, does something specific to how he now approaches the renewed hunt. And it's not the straightforward, grateful inclusion a simpler story might reach for. It's closer to the opposite. Rick C137, confirmed across every chapter of this analysis to organize his entire psychology around the terror of watching something terrible happen to someone he loves and being powerless to stop it, has just been given fresh, undeniable proof of exactly how close Morty came to being in danger during a confrontation Rick himself was unconscious for. He does not process that proof as evidence Morty should be more involved going forward. He processes it as evidence Morty needs to be kept as far from what comes next as Rick can possibly manage. This is consistent with a pattern the show has already established clearly enough across its own confirmed run that this altered timeline doesn't need to invent anything new to justify it. Consider the specific detail already covered in earlier chapters, that when C-137 nearly resumed his hunt for Prime after the Season 6 portal fluid reset briefly returned Prime to his home dimension, it was Morty who talked him out of it. Morty specifically providing the counterweight against Rick's own self-destructive instincts. That confirmed dynamic depends on Morty being present, being included, being given enough visibility into what Rick is actually planning to intervene before the planning becomes action. What Rick is doing in this altered timeline, disappearing from the garage before Morty wakes up, choosing silence over the gruff invitation that's defined nearly every previous adventure across 7 seasons, is a direct attempt to remove that exact counterweight from the equation. Because some part of him, confirmed across this analysis to be capable of exactly this kind of self-aware, self-destructive calculation, understands that if Morty is present this time, Morty might try to stop him again, and this time, unlike the Season 6 reset, Rick does not want to be stopped. Morty finds him eventually, not in the garage, but in a section of the ship's cargo hold Rick has converted, in the space of 3 days, into something between a war room and a shrine to obsession, the kind of space the show has shown Rick build before, in moments of genuine crisis. Wires and salvage tech from a dozen different dimensions, strung together in the specific, controlled chaos that characterizes every piece of technology this character builds when he's working through something he can't name directly. Star charts. Confirmed connections to at least 3 separate informants across factions. This analysis has already established in Chapter 11, meaning Rick has, in fact, already reached out to at least some portion of his wider network, though clearly not with any intention of bringing Morty along for whatever those conversations produce. A partial map of the section of the multiverse beyond the central finite curve, built from fragments, from second-hand accounts, from whatever scraps of information Rick's contacts across the Citadel's institutional panic, covered in Chapter 10, have managed to extract about where a yellow portal might actually lead. Morty doesn't say anything at first. He just stands in the doorway, watching his grandfather work with the specific, focused intensity that Morty has learned, across years of exactly this kind of scene, to recognize as dangerous, the same intensity the show confirmed defined Rick's original decades-long hunt for Prime, before any of the structure of the Citadel or the Curve existed to contain it. And when Rick finally notices him standing there, his response is not the deflection or the sarcasm this character usually reaches for, in moments where sincerity threatens to surface. It's something closer to resignation, an acknowledgement, delivered without looking up from the star chart in front of him, that Morty was always going to find out eventually, that hiding an entire war room, in the cargo hold of a ship they both live on, was never actually going to work as a long-term strategy. Whatever brief, doomed hope Rick might have held onto that it would. What follows is the confirmed pattern this story's central relationship has been building toward since Chapter 1, and it's worth tracing exactly how it plays out, because the leverage in this specific conversation has shifted in a way that gives Morty a strength he's never actually had access to in quite this form before. In every previous confrontation across the show's run, where Morty has tried to talk Rick out of something dangerous, the Season 6 reset being the clearest confirmed example, Morty's argument has been essentially external, an appeal to Rick's own long-term well-being, a warning about what obsession does to him, delivered from the position of someone who cares about Rick, but has no direct, undeniable claim on the specific situation at hand. Here, Morty has something different. He was in that room. He revived Rick himself, alone, with stolen medical tech and nothing resembling Rick's own precision. He has, for the first time in the confirmed history of this relationship, direct standing in exactly the crisis Rick is now trying to shut him out of, and he uses it, plainly, without the nervous hedging that's defined most of his earlier confrontations with Rick across the show's run. He tells Rick that he doesn't get to disappear this time, not because Morty needs to be protected from what's coming, but because Morty already proved, in that lair, that he's capable of being useful in exactly the kind of crisis Rick has spent his entire life insisting Morty needs to be shielded from. Rick's response to this, grounded carefully in everything the show has confirmed about his specific psychology around control and powerlessness, is not immediate capitulation, and it shouldn't be, because a character this defended doesn't simply fold the first time someone makes a reasonable argument at him. He pushes back, hard, reaching for exactly the kind of cutting, deflecting language the show has shown him use before, to end conversations he doesn't want to have, telling Morty, this isn't the same as every other adventure, that Rick Prime already killed one family once, and evil Morty is now smart enough to help him do it more efficiently the second time. It's not an unfair point, and the show's own established stakes across this analysis make clear it isn't manipulation for its own sake. Rick genuinely believes what he's saying, but Morty, confirmed across this analysis to have absorbed enough of Rick's own hard-won resilience across years of exactly this kind of exposure, doesn't back down the way earlier, more nervous versions of this character might have. He points out, directly, that Rick disappearing alone into a war he's already proven he can't win by himself, confirmed by the tactical assessment this analysis already laid out in Chapter 6, isn't actually protection. It's just Rick choosing to die alone, instead of risking that Morty might die alongside him, and dressing that choice up as love. It lands. The show has established, across everything covered about Rick's capacity for genuine self-recognition when the right person says the right thing at the right moment, Dr. Wong's confirmed diagnosis in Chapter 7 being the clearest prior example, that Rick is capable of hearing hard truths when they come from someone he can't simply dismiss as an outsider looking in. Morty is not an outsider here. He's the person who already saved Rick's life once in exactly this fight. And Rick, standing in a cargo hold full of star charts and stolen intelligence, 3 days into a hunt he'd been trying to run entirely alone, doesn't say yes outright, doesn't suddenly transform into the kind of partner he's already confirmed, back in Chapter 8 of this broader story's premise, to have never fully been. But he doesn't tell Morty to leave, either. He turns the star chart around, slowly, so Morty can actually see what's on it, and starts explaining what he's found. It's not everything. It's not the full partnership Morty is actually asking for, and the show's own established pattern for this specific relationship, confirmed repeatedly across this entire analysis, to be built on genuine but deeply incomplete progress, rather than clean, permanent resolution, suggests it was never going to be everything. Not this quickly, not after one conversation in a cargo hold. But it's a door opening that was, 3 minutes earlier, closed and locked from the inside. Rick tells Morty about the fragments his contacts across the Citadel and the wider network covered in Chapter 11 have pieced together, about the rough, unconfirmed region of space beyond the curve's boundary where a yellow portal signature was detected once, weeks ago, before it vanished entirely. He tells Morty this isn't a rescue mission, and it isn't a straightforward hunt, not the way the original decades-long pursuit of Prime alone ever was. It's something closer to reconnaissance, careful, patient, the exact opposite of the reckless, single-minded momentum that's defined every previous stage of this character's confirmed obsession with Rick Prime. And for the first time since the events in that lair, Rick C-137 actually says something that sounds, however roughly, however incompletely, like the beginning of the true partnership he already told Morty, back in the real timeline's confirmed Season 5, he'd never actually built. He asks Morty what he thinks they should do first. Chapter 13. The region of space beyond the central finite curve's confirmed boundary has never been mapped, and that specific gap in the show's own established mythology matters enormously for understanding exactly what kind of problem Rick and Morty are now trying to solve. Every previous adventure across 7 confirmed seasons, every dimension the audience has ever seen Rick and Morty visit, exists inside the walled section of the multiverse Evil Morty described in his own words during the Rick Mirai Jack finale, the section where some version of Rick Sanchez is guaranteed to remain the most intelligent being alive. The section every green portal Rick has ever used across the entirety of the show's run is structurally locked into. What lies beyond that wall has been shown exactly once, in a single, brief, unexplained glimpse of the yellow portal Evil Morty stepped through, and confirmed nowhere else in the show's own material, because the show itself has never needed to depict it. It exists purely as an idea, a space defined entirely by what it isn't, unrestricted, unmapped, unguaranteed to favor Rick's supremacy, the way every dimension inside the curve has always been engineered to guarantee. This creates a specific and unusual technical problem for Rick C-137, one worth walking through carefully, because it's the first genuine obstacle in this entire altered timeline that Rick's own confirmed engineering brilliance cannot simply brute force its way past. Every portal gun Rick has ever built or used across the show's confirmed history operates on green portal technology. The exact infrastructure Evil Morty explained, in his own words, is deliberately restricted to the walled section of the multiverse. Rick did not build that restriction by accident, and this analysis has already covered, back in the earlier chapters examining the central finite curve's origin, exactly why he built it that way, as a wall around infinity, constructed largely through his own confirmed efforts. Initially conceived to help narrow the hunt for Prime by containing the search to a controllable section of reality, but expanded and maintained afterward because it also guaranteed something no other structure in Rick's life ever fully delivered: the certainty that stepping through a portal would never accidentally land him somewhere he wasn't the most capable being in the room. That certainty, confirmed across this entire analysis to be the physical expression of Rick's deepest psychological wound, is now the exact thing standing between him and the two beings he needs to find. Rick does not, this story has to be honest about the technical reality of what he's facing, simply build a yellow portal gun over the next few days through sheer determination and late nights in the cargo hold. Confirmed nowhere in the show's own material, Is Evil Morty's yellow portal technology ever explained in enough detail for the audience, or for this story, to assume Rick could simply reverse engineer it from secondhand descriptions and a single grainy account of what the exit looked like? What Rick has, working from the fragments his network covered in earlier chapters has gathered, is something closer to a very expensive, very slow process of elimination, tracking not the portal technology itself, but the specific gravitational and dimensional disturbances that a passage through the curve's boundary would theoretically produce, the kind of trace evidence that even an unmapped region of space would leave behind if something crossed into or out of it. This is grounded honestly in what Rick's confirmed engineering capability across the show actually looks like when he's solving a genuinely novel problem, rather than simply applying existing solutions. Slow, meticulous work, closer to detective investigation than to the fast, improvised brilliance the show usually depicts him deploying under pressure. It takes weeks. This detail matters for the emotional texture of what's actually happening to Rick and Morty during this stretch of the story, because the show has established, repeatedly across its confirmed run, that Rick operates worst under exactly this kind of extended, low-intensity tension, the slow grinding uncertainty of a problem that won't resolve quickly, as opposed to the acute crises he's confirmed to handle, with genuine competence, and even a kind of dark enjoyment. The decades-long original hunt for Prime, established across this analysis's earlier chapters, was itself defined by exactly this kind of extended uncertainty, and it's worth remembering that this specific texture of waiting, of searching without confirmation that the search is even pointed in the right direction, is precisely the condition under which Rick's confirmed drinking and instability have historically worsened rather than improved. What's different this time, and this is the load-bearing detail this entire chapter exists to establish, is that Morty is actually present for it. Confirmed in the previous chapter to have forced his way into genuine inclusion rather than being kept at the periphery, the way earlier stages of this altered hunt initially unfolded, Morty spends these weeks doing something the show has never really shown him do before, across any of its confirmed seasons, sitting with Rick through the specific, grinding tedium of investigative work, rather than being swept up in the fast-moving adventure segments that have defined nearly every previous episode of their shared history. He learns, out of necessity, how to read the gravitational disturbance charts Rick is compiling. He starts, tentatively at first, and then with growing confidence, offering his own observations, catching patterns Rick, exhausted and increasingly frayed by weeks of dead ends, occasionally misses. There's a specific night, roughly 3 weeks into this stretch, that deserves attention, because it's the first moment in this entire altered timeline where the show's established pattern of Rick's collapse, under exactly this kind of sustained pressure, actually threatens to reassert itself fully. Rick has been awake for what Morty estimates, based on the state of the cargo hold and the specific slur that's crept into Rick's speech, to be somewhere close to 2 full days straight, fueled by exactly the combination of alcohol and stubborn refusal to stop that this analysis has already established, across multiple earlier chapters, as Rick's confirmed default response to exactly this kind of grief-adjacent obsession. He's chasing a lead that Morty, looking at the same data with fresher eyes, can tell is almost certainly a dead end, a gravitational anomaly that matches the rough profile they're looking for, but that Morty, cross-referencing against an earlier chart Rick himself compiled, and then apparently forgot in his exhaustion, can see, doesn't actually align with the timeline of when Prime and Evil Morty would have needed to cross it. Morty tells him, and Rick, in a moment the show's own confirmed characterization, makes entirely believable, rather than out of place, turns on him, not violently, but with the specific, cutting dismissiveness this character reaches for reflexively when someone questions him, during exactly this kind of fragile, exhausted state, the same dismissiveness that, confirmed back in Chapter 8 of the broader analysis covering the Vat of Acid episode, has historically escalated into genuine cruelty when Rick feels his competence challenged during a moment he's already struggling to hold together. He tells Morty he doesn't need a second opinion from a 14-year-old on interdimensional gravitational mapping. It's sharp. It's meant to end the conversation the way this exact tone has ended countless conversations across the show's confirmed run. Except this time, Morty doesn't retreat the way earlier, more nervous versions of this dynamic across the show's history have shown him retreat. He stays exactly where he is, and he says, flatly, that Rick is drunk and exhausted and wrong, and that if Rick actually wants to find Prime before Prime and Evil Morty finish whatever they're building, He needs to sleep, and let Morty keep working the charts while he does. It's a small moment. It doesn't resolve into a speech or a breakthrough, the way a more conventional version of this beat might be written. Rick doesn't apologize. He doesn't suddenly soften, but he sits down, heavily, in the chair behind him, and after a long, silent moment, he tells Morty to wake him if anything changes. And he actually sleeps, for the first time in 2 days, while Morty, alone in the cargo hold at 3 in the morning, keeps working the exact chart Rick was too exhausted to trust him with an hour earlier. It's 4 days after that when they finally get a real signal. Not a definitive location, not a clean coordinate they can simply plug into a portal gun and step through, but a confirmed, cross-referenced disturbance pattern, the kind of trace evidence Rick's original methodology was built to eventually find, consistent enough across multiple independent data points that both of them, exhausted and increasingly worn down by weeks of dead ends, recognize it immediately for what it is. Somewhere beyond the curve's boundary, in a region of space neither green portal technology nor any prior Rick has ever confirmed accessing, something large enough and technologically sophisticated enough to register on Rick's instruments has been operating steadily, continuously, for weeks, in exactly the pattern a stronghold built by two beings settling into an extended, defensive project would produce. They've found the general direction. Not the stronghold itself, not yet. Not with the precision required to actually cross into it safely. But for the first time since that layer collapsed around them, Rick's C-137 has something concrete to move toward. And it's worth naming plainly, because it's the exact detail this entire chapter has been building toward. That he found it because Morty was there to catch the mistake exhaustion and grief were about to let him make. Chapter 14. Crossing the boundary itself is the part of this altered timeline that has to be handled with the most technical honesty, because the show's own established rules about the central finite curve make clear this isn't something Rick can simply will his way through with confidence and improvisation, the way he's solved countless other problems across 7 confirmed seasons. Green portal technology, confirmed repeatedly across this analysis, is structurally locked into the walled section of the multiverse. What Rick has actually built, over the final stretch of the weeks covered in the previous chapter, isn't a yellow portal gun in any sense that mirrors Evil Morty's confirmed technology. It's something closer to a one-way single-use puncture, a device designed to force a narrow, temporary breach at the exact coordinates the gravitational disturbance pattern pointed toward, built with the specific, grim awareness, which Rick states plainly to Morty before they use it, that he has no confirmed way of guaranteeing it will work twice, or that whatever ship or vessel doesn't cross with them will still be there waiting on the other side of that breach, when they eventually need to leave. Morty asks, reasonably, what happens if it doesn't work at all? Rick's answer, delivered with the specific flat honesty this analysis has already established, he's become slightly more capable of extending to Morty across the events of the previous 2 chapters, is that they'll find out together, because he's not doing this part without him either. It's a small line, easy to miss, but it's worth marking directly against the man who disappeared from the garage without a word, 3 weeks earlier in Chapter 12, because the distance between those 2 moments is the entire quiet arc this altered timeline has been tracking underneath its larger plot. The breach holds. They cross. What's actually on the other side, and this has to be built carefully and specifically from what the show has already confirmed, rather than invented wholesale, is not simply more of the same kind of space the audience has watched across 7 seasons of adventures inside the curve. The show's own internal logic, established through Evil Morty's own explanation of why the curve was built in the first place, guarantees that everything inside the wall is dimensionally selected to favor some version of Rick's supremacy. Beyond it, there's no such guarantee, and the immediate, visceral effect of that absence is disorienting in a way this story has to actually depict rather than gloss past. Rick's instruments, built and calibrated entirely around the physics and dimensional rules of the curve's interior, struggle for several long, tense minutes to even properly register where they are, throwing readings that don't match any known reference point, forcing Rick, for perhaps the first time across this entire altered timeline, into a position of genuine, disorienting uncertainty about his own surroundings, the exact condition his engineering across the whole series has always been built specifically to prevent. It's Morty, watching the readings scroll past with the same fresh, less anchored perspective that let him catch Rick's mistake back in Chapter 13, who first notices the pattern underneath the chaos, a structure, faint but consistent, radiating from a fixed point roughly 6 hours travel from their current position. Rick confirms it once he stops trying to force the readings into a framework built for a different kind of space entirely, and starts actually looking at what's in front of him. Something built, something large. Something that has been sitting in this exact location, stable and undisturbed, for exactly the length of time consistent with the stronghold this story's earlier chapters already established Prime and Evil Morty would need to construct in the immediate aftermath of their escape. They don't approach directly. This part of the sequence is worth grounding specifically in Rick's confirmed tactical instincts across the show's entire run, because whatever emotional volatility has defined the previous weeks, the actual, cold, calculating part of Rick's mind, the part that built a functioning portal gun from grief alone decades earlier, the part that survived encounters with beings across the multiverse who should have killed him a dozen times over, reasserts itself completely the moment there's an actual target in front of him. He kills the ship's power signature to the barest minimum required for life support, brings them in slow, on a drift trajectory rather than an active approach vector that any half-competent detection system would flag immediately, and spends nearly 2 more hours in near-total silence, watching the structure grow larger through the viewport, gathering whatever passive information the ship's remaining instruments can pull without emitting anything that might give away their position. What they see, once they're close enough for visual confirmation, matches the functional, defensive character this story's earlier chapters already established for the Stronghold Prime and Evil Morty would realistically build together. It isn't ornate, it isn't a monument to either being's ego, consistent with everything Chapter 7 already established about the purely instrumental, survival-driven motivations underneath this alliance's very first joint project. It's dense, layered, clearly built for defense first, and everything else a distant second. The kind of structure that reads, even from a cautious distance, as the work of two minds who understood exactly what kind of threat might eventually come looking for them, and built accordingly. And then, almost by accident, in the specific way near misses in high-tension fiction often actually happen, rather than the way a more contrived version of this beat might stage it, they see him. Rick Prime, alone, outside the main structure, on what appears to be some kind of external maintenance platform, working on something Rick's instruments can't fully identify from this distance. He's not surrounded by defenses in that specific moment. He's not flanked by Evil Morty. He is, for this narrow window, exactly as exposed as he was in that ruined lair weeks earlier, before everything about this altered timeline diverged from the story the audience actually watched. Rick C-137's hand moves toward the ship's weapons controls before conscious thought fully catches up to the impulse, and this reaction has to be understood as completely consistent with everything this analysis has established about him across every previous chapter. Decades of hunting, a confrontation stolen from him at the exact moment it should have concluded. The single most consuming obsession of his entire adult life, sitting right there, undefended, close enough to end. It's Morty who stops him, grabbing his arm, not with panic, but with the same steady, hard-won clarity that's defined every one of his interventions across this altered timeline's slow build. He doesn't tell Rick to let Prime go out of mercy or hesitation. He tells him, fast and low, that firing now, from an unprepared ship, with unknown defenses they haven't mapped, and no confirmed location for Evil Morty, who could be anywhere inside that structure and could retaliate within seconds, isn't a killing shot. It's a warning shot, one that guarantees Prime knows they've found him, guarantees the stronghold gets abandoned and rebuilt somewhere even harder to trace, and guarantees they lose whatever advantage weeks of careful, quiet tracking just bought them. Rick's hand stays on the controls for a long, silent moment. The show's own established psychology for this character, confirmed across every chapter of this broader analysis, makes clear exactly how much this moment costs him, because restraint, in the face of Prime specifically, is not something this man has ever been confirmed to be naturally capable of. But he pulls his hand back, slowly, and they drift, in near total silence, back out of detection range, carrying with them the single most valuable piece of information this hunt has produced since the lair. They know where the stronghold is, and Rick Prime, for the first time since that offer was made in the wreckage weeks ago, does not yet know he's been found. Chapter 15. There's a version of this story that spends 5 more hours chasing the confrontation this hunt has been building toward, the assault on the stronghold, the fracture between Prime and Evil Morty finally breaking into the open, The reckoning C-137 has spent his entire adult life either running toward or running from, depending on which chapter of his own psychology happens to be in control that day. That version exists in outline, somewhere in the structure this analysis was built on. This isn't that version. This is where it ends, quietly, on a ship drifting dark and silent, just outside detection range. Two people who have finally, for the first time in this altered timeline, found exactly what they came looking for. And it's worth closing here, rather than pushing further into the fight itself, because the actual weight of this story was never really in whether Rick pulls the trigger eventually. The show has already told you who Rick Sanchez is. Underneath every layer of performance, this entire analysis has spent its earlier chapters unpacking. A man who built a wall around infinity because he couldn't build one around a single afternoon in a garage. A man who says nothing matters and then spends decades proving, through every single action he's ever taken, that everything does. What this altered timeline actually changes isn't the shape of Rick's grief, or the coldness of Rick Prime, or the careful, evaluative distance Evil Morty keeps from everyone he's ever met. All of it grounded, across 15 chapters now, in exactly what the show itself confirmed about each of them. What changes is who's sitting next to Rick when the moment finally arrives. Go back to the very first divergence this story ever made, because it's worth returning to it here at the end. The way the show itself so often circles back to its own opening images once it's finished proving what they meant. In the real timeline, Rick's life is saved by an enemy. Evil Morty revives him out of calculation, a deliberate move in a larger game, and Rick wakes up owing something uncomfortable, to a being he has every confirmed reason to distrust, a debt that colors the strange, watchful relationship the two of them carry through the episodes that follow in the world the audience actually watched. That single choice, who kneels down and does the reviving, is the entire hinge this 15-chapter story was built around. And everything that followed from it, Morty's changed standing in Rick's eyes, the war room in the cargo hold, the argument that finally cracked it open, the weeks of gravitational charts and dead ends, and one very bad, very human moment where an exhausted man lashed out at the one person trying to help him. All of it traces back to that single altered image. Not an enemy kneeling over Rick's body with a calculated purpose. His own grandson, clumsy, terrified, dragging him out of the wreckage because some things in this specific family have never needed a strategy to justify themselves. That's worth sitting with for a moment, because it reframes something this analysis established clearly all the way back in its earliest chapters, when it walked through Rick's actual, confirmed psychology underneath the nihilism, underneath the catchphrase that translates to a plea for help nobody around him ever quite hears, underneath the central finite curve itself, an entire structure built out of one man's terror of being powerless again, the way he was powerless in a garage decades ago, watching a bomb fall on the only thing he'd ever chosen over infinite power. Every wall this character has ever built, confirmed across everything this analysis worked through, exists to prevent exactly one experience from repeating itself: the specific helplessness of loving something and being unable to protect it. What this altered timeline does, quietly, without ever needing to state it outright, the way a lesser version of this story might, is put Rick back inside that exact fear and then answer it differently. He was unconscious. He was helpless. Someone he loves was in danger, in a room he couldn't do anything about. And this time, instead of a bomb falling because he refused an offer, someone he loves refused to let him die, and succeeded. That's not a small correction to make to this character's mythology. It's the specific, targeted answer to the one wound this entire analysis spent its early chapters establishing as the load-bearing structure underneath everything else Rick Sanchez has ever done. Confirmed across the show's own material, this is a man who built an AI in his old house specifically to remind himself, every single day, of his failure to save the person he loved most. He kept that wound open on purpose, because closing it felt, to him, like the final abandonment of the person he lost. What this altered timeline offers him instead, without ever asking him to let go of Diane, without ever asking him to stop grieving the specific, irreplaceable shape of what Rick Prime took from him, is a second data point. Proof, undeniable and freshly earned, that the people he loves now are not simply waiting to be lost the same way. That sometimes, when everything goes wrong, someone shows up anyway, with nothing but stolen medical tech and refusal to accept the ending everyone else in the room had already assumed. Consider, too, what this changes about the shape of the hunt itself. Because that's the other structural thread this story has been carrying since Chapter 5. When this analysis asked directly whether Rick would keep hunting Prime and Evil Morty, and answered, honestly, that of course he would, because everything the show has ever confirmed about this specific character's relationship to unresolved loss says the hunt was never actually optional. What was optional, what this altered timeline actually tested, across every chapter since, was the shape that Hunt would take. The real Rick Sanchez, across decades of confirmed backstory, hunted Prime entirely alone, building his first portal gun out of grief, with no one beside him, colliding with version after version of himself across an unstructured multiverse, founding an entire civilization's worth of infrastructure, almost by accident, because there was no one there to tell him to stop, to slow down, to notice when exhaustion was making him miss something obvious on a gravitational chart at 3 in the morning. That version of Rick built walls because walls were the only structure available to a man, with no one standing close enough to catch him when he started to fall. This version of Rick had Morty. Not a perfect partner, not a fully healed relationship suddenly free of every scar. This analysis spent its middle chapters tracing back through the vat of acid, through the manufactured brainwave economics of the central finite curve, through every documented instance of Rick treating this specific boy as a resource before he ever treated him as a person. The argument in the cargo hold wasn't clean. Rick didn't apologize the way a simpler story might have written it. He turned the star chart around and asked Morty what he thought they should do first. And that's not absolution. That's not the full, true partnership Rick already confessed. In the real timeline, he'd never actually built. It's smaller than that, and more honest than that. Exactly the kind of incremental, unfinished progress this whole analysis argued, back in its exploration of Rick's actual character arc, is the only kind of progress a character built this specific way is capable of making. Not a destination, a direction. And it's worth naming plainly what that direction actually produced, because it's the entire practical difference between the timeline the audience watched and the one this story imagined instead. In the real Unmortrican, Rick wins the fight, but loses the reckoning, beats Prime to death, without ever getting the one thing decades of hunting secretly promised him: some acknowledgement, some proof that the man who took everything from him understood the weight of what he'd taken. He collapses afterward, confirmed directly in the show's own material, falls back into drinking, loses direction entirely, because revenge was never actually capable of filling the hole it was built to distract him from. In this altered timeline, the fight hasn't happened yet, but something else already has. Rick found the stronghold not because he outworked everyone else through sheer isolated genius, the way the real timeline's confirmed backstory says he always has before, but because a 14-year-old caught a mistake exhausted grief was about to make. At 3 in the morning, in a cargo hold, neither of them had slept properly in for days. Whatever happens next, whenever this story eventually returns to finish it, Rick doesn't walk into that stronghold carrying the same hollow, solitary momentum that's defined every previous stage of this specific war. He walks in already having been saved once, already having let himself be helped once, already standing just slightly closer to the version of himself that Season 1 Rick, the one Dr. Wong diagnosed so precisely in that pickle episode, the one who cracked jokes about Full House and swore this show would never let anyone learn anything, insisted for years wasn't actually possible. That's the story underneath the story this whole 15-chapter analysis was actually telling, disguised as a hunt across the unmapped multiverse, disguised as tactics and gravitational charts, and a stronghold built by two of the most dangerous minds the show's mythology has ever produced. Not whether Rick Sanchez can win a fight against Rick Prime and Evil Morty combined, though the tactical breakdown all the way back in Chapter 6 already made clear exactly how steep that particular climb would be. Whether Rick Sanchez, after everything, after Diane, after the decades, after the central finite curve, and the walls, and the catchphrase that means "I am in great pain, please help me," delivered for years to a family who only ever heard the joke, can actually let himself be helped by the people who are standing right there, offering. This altered timeline says yes. Not completely, not cleanly, not without cost, but yes. In the small, real, unglamorous way this character has always been capable of change. One conversation at a time. One door left open instead of locked. One grandson refusing to let his grandfather disappear into a war room alone. Wherever the fight in that stronghold eventually goes, whatever Prime and Evil Morty's fractured, unstable alliance finally breaks into, that's the part of this story worth carrying with you. because it's the truest thing this entire analysis, across every chapter, ever actually argued about who Rick Sanchez really is, underneath the nihilism and the drinking and the portal gun. Not a man who doesn't care. A man who cares so much he built an entire multiverse to keep himself from ever being hurt like that again. And who is, slowly, imperfectly, one small choice at a time, learning that the walls were never actually protecting him from anything. They were just keeping the people who might have caught him out. Thank you for spending this time with us tonight. If this hunt through the multiverse, through grief and revenge, and the long, quiet work of finally letting someone in, kept you good company, let it carry you the rest of the way now. Set it down here. Close your eyes. Let the ship drift dark and quiet, safe for now, just outside the edge of everything that's still waiting to happen. There's nothing left to chase tonight. Rest well.